and I'll be hosting the event today. Some general housekeeping rules just before we get started. If the session is being recorded and recording has already started, if everybody wouldn't mind, please turning their cameras and microphones off for the duration of the event. The chat box will be open for any questions and comments, and we will ask the speakers after their session. I'll ask the speakers after their session. The questions can be responded to in the chat or followed up after the event. So just getting back onto what we're going to be hearing and seeing today. We've got a packed agenda, as you can see. There have been some minor tweaks to the agenda, last minute tweaks. So just to give a quick run through of what who we're going to be hearing from today. We've got Jane Hutt, the Minister for Social Justice, opening the event series, because this is the first of 4 events that we're going to be hosting over the next couple of weeks. Sally Holland, the Children's Commissioner, is going to be opening the day. We also then have presentations from the Lighthouse London, NSPCC, the CSA and the Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Centre in North Wales. The event has a hashtag, so if everybody wouldn't mind tweeting and promoting the event, that would be fantastic. Our hashtag is WSAS Learning, so that's WSAS Learning, or the Welsh Dysgu Gyrraca. Just to say to everybody as well, the content of today can be quite emotive, and please feel free to leave the event or contact the Live Fear Free helpline if anything affects you during the event. The Live Fear Free helpline is behind me. You probably can't see it all. It's 0808 8010 800, and that will be in the chat bar for you. It'll also be flashed up at the breaks on a hold-in slide. So that's the introductions done. I hope everybody enjoys today. We'll start now with Jane Hutt, who's going to do the opening for the event. Thank you all.
As Minister for Social Justice and leading tackling violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence, I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity to provide the opening remarks at this learning event, which also sees the launch of a new community practice and the development of a peer support network across Wales. Supporting victims of sexual violence and abuse in Wales and ensuring they have access to the services and support they need is a key priority for the Welsh Government. It is an area that is of personal interest to me, one I have campaigned to improve for a number of years. It's a priority supported by the wellbeing objectives set out in our programme for government, which includes providing effective, high quality and sustainable healthcare, as well as protecting, rebuilding and developing our services for vulnerable people. These objectives are fundamental when it comes to considering the needs of people who are the victims and survivors of sexual assault. Crucially, it also supports objectives within our WSAS national strategy to provide victims with equal access to appropriately resourced, high-quality, needs-led, strength-based, gender-responsive services across Wales. Here in Wales, through the leadership provided by the NHS Collaborative and the Welsh Sexual Assault Services Programme, we're continuing to work in partnership with the NHS, the police, the third sector and other partners to provide access to sexual assault services and referral centres. This joint working ensures access to trained and experienced professionals for help, support and advice for the victims and survivors of sexual assault. Ensuring that relevant professionals are trained to provide effective, timely and appropriate responses to victims and survivors of abuse is critical. Our WSAS National Strategy Framework offers training from awareness level through to specialist training for the WSAS workforce. Furthermore, we have robust collaborative working arrangements in place to ensure a multi-agency response to victims of sexual abuse through the Sexual Assault Services Programme, with the ultimate aim of improving health outcomes for victims and survivors of sexual assault. We've consistently made it clear that children who are sexually abused deserve the best possible child-centred support. Services must operate in a way that supports their emotional well-being and assists them to recover from the trauma of abuse. In particular, all partners have agreed and are working towards a new, more integrated service delivery model for sexual assault referrals centres in Wales. The new model, based on a regional approach with hubs in Cardiff, Swansea and Aberystwyth, with an integrated service also being provided in North Wales. The Sexual Assault Services Programme is driving delivery of child and person-centred services to ensure the best outcomes for victims of sexual abuse and violence, with the victim's voice at the centre. There are other developments here in Wales that are also supporting this critical agenda, particularly in terms of workforce development and training. Our National Action Plan on Preventing and Responding to Child Sexual Abuse has put a clear focus on the delivery of tangible actions by the Welsh Government and Safeguarding Children boards in Wales to prevent child sexual abuse and exploitation, to protect children at risk, and to support abused children into recovery. Alongside this, Traumatic Stress Wales is funded by the Welsh Government and aims to improve the health and well-being of people at risk of or with post-traumatic stress disorder. The work of Traumatic Stress Wales includes a specialist work stream focused on improving support for people who've experienced sexual assault. The training events planned by the NHS Collaborative, alongside the development of the new community of practice and peer support network, were directly aligned with the Traumatic Stress Wales sexual assault work stream. And this is an important collaboration that will contribute to improved outcomes for those victims and survivors of sexual assault. In addition, a focus on children, young people and adults, I'm pleased to see that the training events will also reflect the needs of minority ethnic and LGBTQ communities. We've all seen the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic and the inequalities in health outcomes that continue to exist, including a focus on those with protected characteristics, and supporting the development of services that reflect their needs is crucial. Furthermore, whilst we continue to prioritise sexual assault services, our ambition is to end all forms of violence against women through our Violence Against Women, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence National Strategy. Public consultation on our revised WSAS strategy recently closed, and we're working through responses with the aim of publishing our next 5-year strategy in the early summer. The refreshed strategy has been developed alongside a group of key partner organisations, including the police, PCCs and the specialist sector, who provide such an incredible and invaluable support to victims and survivors of sexual abuse, as well as other forms of WSAS. The strategy aims to increase and strengthen joint working with agencies such as the police and criminal justice partners, and instilling confidence in victims to report, to hold those who abuse to account. At its heart, the revised strategy recognises WSAS is a societal issue that requires a societal response. Tackling male violence, gender inequality and misogyny require action at both ends of the spectrum. And we must support survivors and we must hold perpetrators to account, but we must also create genuine behaviour change. This is how we will combat the dangerous and destructive negative attitudes towards women that can manifest in acts associated with sexual violence and abuse. Our 2020 This Is Sexual Abuse campaign focused on raising awareness of sexual abuse and was developed using lived experiences of victims across Wales. More recently, we've launched the Call Out Only campaign to help people identify behaviours associated with street and sexual harassment, acknowledging that the experiences of women and girls are serious and prevalent and can cause fear, alarm and distress. The campaign calls on the public, males particularly, to safely call out and challenge assumptions about harassment against women, often wrongly seen as harmless, with their peers, friends and colleagues. Our Live Fear Free helpline is a free 24/7 service for all victims and survivors of violence against women, domestic abuse and sexual violence. To conclude, I'd like to thank those colleagues at the NHS Collaborative and their partners who have developed the training events and wish everyone well. I also look forward to hearing about the ongoing work of the Community of Practice and Peer Support Network.
Thank you, Jane. So we'll be moving on next to the opening of the event today for the Children's and Young People's element, which will be from Sally Holland, the Children's Commissioner. So we just get the next recording up. Sorry, if you just bear with us for a minute while we get the recording. There we go. Vandalism to his truck and the return of furniture. Cindy is covered.
Hello, I'm Sally Holland. I'm the Children's Commissioner for Wales, and I'm really sorry I can't be with you here today in your session in person, but I wanted to send a quick message about the relevance of children's rights to all that you're talking about today, and also to talk a little bit about what I and my office have been doing to support the work that you all do. Just as a reminder, it's my job to make sure that all children's rights are protected and that all children know about their rights as well. And I do that in lots of ways, including by listening to children, by making sure that the policymakers and others understand about children's rights, by scrutinising what's going on and trying to fill gaps, whether that's in legislation or in provision of services. And we also have a casework service that helps individual children and young people as well access their rights. So of course, lots of children's human rights are really relevant to the work that's under discussion today. Children have the right to be listened to and taken seriously, and of course that's often the first step that's so important in children coming forward to report sexual assault and sexual abuse. Children have a right, lots of rights actually, under the UN Convention to be kept safe, including specific rights about being kept safe from sexual abuse, trafficking and sexual harm in any way. They also have a right to health care and good quality health care, and that should be child-centred health care, of course. And there's an article that's really important to the work that you all do that not everyone knows about, and that's Article 39. Children have the right to be supported to recover from trauma and abuse and given the support they need so they can continue with their lives and thrive in their lives as well. So all the work that those of you who are involved in supporting children or treating children or helping children recover from sexual abuse and sexual assault is human rights work, and in your work you are of course human rights workers. And I think it's important that we think of ourselves in that way. You know, we don't support children just because we feel sorry for them or because we think we ought to. We support children and give them what they need because they have a human right, an entitlement to really good quality child-centred services. Now, back in 2018, it was brought to my attention through the Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Roundtable that I run that there was a bit of an issue around provision of sexual assault referral centres. The one in the north was still functioning well, it was well staffed and had a good funding formula, but in the south there were some real issues around funding, around staffing and about the sort of reach of provision. And you know, this was brought to our office by workers in that field who were concerned they weren't able to give children what the support they needed and the treatment that they needed. Children were having to wait a long time before having an examination and being told they couldn't change or shower in that time. I mean, sometimes, you know, for more than 24 hours, children were having to travel an awful long way across Wales to be seen as well. I raised those concerns with government and publicly in the press, and I'm pleased to say that there was a good response, both from the government and from the services, the police and health services and others involved in this. And there's been some really solid work going on since then to try to improve the services right across South, Mid and West Wales. It's been slow progress, partly related to the workforce issues which you will all know how it's such highly specialised, careful work that we need to make sure that we have the right people examining children, treating children and supporting children in this work, and that takes time to build up. But despite this, our services throughout Wales are doing some excellent work. You know, you are seeing children out of hours if needed, you're giving them careful care and you're supporting them. And I've met children in both the North and the South Sarks who have told me how much the service has helped them and supported them, and their parents have too. So I just want to finish by saying a huge thanks for all that you do. You know, my team and I will continue to keep a close eye on these services, continue to push for a better geographical spread, bearing in mind it's a very specialist service, but so that children don't miss out on their rights. And we'll also be pushing hard to make sure there's enough recovery services for children so they can go on to thrive throughout their lives and get over any trauma they've experienced. I hope the session goes well today, and diolch am wrando. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sally. That was fantastic. So just to start out with our main presenters today, we're kicking off the session with Emma Harewood, who's the strategic lead for the Lighthouse Centre in London. And I'll pass over to Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. Are you sharing the slides for me, or shall I bring them up?
Up to you entirely, Emma. We have them if you wish, or if you wish to.
I might just do it. It's a little bit, makes it a little bit easier to go at the right pace. Okay. Oh. There we go. Can everyone see those okay?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. It's a real privilege really to come and tell you about the work that we've been doing in London, and to hopefully share some ideas that might help shape your great plans that you have in Wales for your SARCs. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit today about the Child House model. And then think about, I guess, for us, what's been really helpful in terms of co-designing that service with victims and survivors, working across the different agencies together, and really creating a very child-friendly approach in the model. I thought you might also be interested to hear a bit this morning about some of our plans for sustainably funding this model going forward, because obviously that's always a really important consideration. How do we keep this work going? So what is the Lighthouse? The Lighthouse is a service for children that have experienced sexual abuse, 0 to 18-year-old children, but also up to 25-year-olds with learning disabilities that might benefit from a more child-friendly approach. And the service supports not only the children, but also their parents, carers, siblings, and I guess the wider community, and their network of professionals that support them. So it really does feel like a very wraparound service. I think the other important thing is that the service goes at the pace of the child, and that's been something that's been a real challenge as we've developed the service over the last 3.5 years. Working across agencies, everyone has different pressures and different professional ways of working, different timelines and different expectations. And so that's really been at the heart of some of our learning, is how together do we as professionals find a way to actually keep the child at the centre and go at the pace that's right for them. So you can see here on the slide some of the teams that we have at the Lighthouse: a health team, an advocacy team, an emotional support team. Plus within the Child House we have social care liaison officers and police officers who liaise outside with the local social workers and the police officers investigating the crimes. And that's been really important to us, having those different elements and different professionals working in the same space. The model comes from learning from Iceland and Scandinavia in the Barnahus model and the Barnahus quality standards, as well as the National Children's Advocacy Centres that have been around in America since the 80s. And together we've taken that and created something that fits within the England Wales kind of social care safeguarding justice pathways, and created a model called the Child House. And you'll see there 2 documents published the end of last year, which give really helpful overview. One is the Child House Local Partnerships Guidance published by the Home Office, which gives really good guidance in terms of commissioning services across the agencies. And the other document on the left there, the Child House in a Box Toolkit, is an incredibly detailed document that really is available either for commissioners, policymakers or providers, talking in huge detail about how to set the model up, and I guess what we learnt in London, what went well and what didn't. So again, a really great resource to dip into to pick the part that you are working on at the moment, whether that be estates, thinking about staffing, thinking about how to involve children and young people. Oops, sorry about that. So the principles of the Child House, and here's some pictures of our service just to whet your appetite a little bit in terms of the space. The principle, as I said, is all the agencies are based together, and the idea is to create this one safe space, and it really feels like that. Children come in off a fairly nondescript street in London, come into a building, and often will be just feel suddenly, oh, like they can take a breath, like it's a really safe space. And that was very important to us, because our belief is that that is the best way, one, to prevent any further traumatization of a child during any examination or evidence collection or any interview process, but also it makes it most likely that they can give their best evidence, which can help with the criminal justice process. But in this same space, children and their families can access short-term and long-term support groups. We've been doing a lot of thinking about pre-trial therapy as well. And at the heart of what we do is that children have shaped it. So these rooms that you can see here were designed with children. There was a really strong message that they wanted each room to have a bit of a feel or a flavour. So the one at the top left is called the garden room. It's got grass on the floor. The one at the bottom, unsurprisingly, is called the sky room. Children were really involved in shaping that, and often will say, have a favourite room that they want to go and spend time in with professionals. So this is our reception area, and some of the unique features that we're able to offer is a show around, either by showing a video, which we'll show you later, that's available on YouTube to text to young people and children, or to physically come and have a look around the building. It can be really daunting to start this process, and we have found that actually just slowing down the pace a little, letting children come and have a look around first, can help them feel much more confident when they come back perhaps the next day to give their video recorded interview, or to come for the holistic examination and assessment. The other thing young people were really clear about, and families, was wanting one person. So we have an ISVA or an advocate who works as a caseworker to support the family throughout that whole process. So they're really the voice that can help when there's a complex decision to make, when a young person may not understand the criminal justice process, or just really to link up the different services within the Lighthouse. And I guess the benefit of being under one roof from a staff perspective is that we are able to speak to each other directly, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. The other thing that's quite different, and this has been a real lesson for us in terms of busting some myths, has been around making sure that the joint appointment with the doctor, the advocate, the wellbeing practitioner, the play specialist, isn't focused just around the examination. And I really appreciate in many places where the focus is on collecting forensic DNA evidence, there are really strict processes that need to be followed, and sometimes that can impact on the speed or how the child can experience it. The Lighthouse only sees children more than 3 days after, so we have that opportunity to be able to go a little bit slower. There isn't the urgency to collect DNA evidence, but obviously there's still a huge detail of evidence collected through photo documentation of injuries, and you may be able to see on the screen there that little tiny camera just by the bedside is the colposcope that's used to gather the evidence. But it's a space where that is only part of the morning. During that morning, the child will meet that whole broader team, and we really make sure that the morning focuses on what they want to get out of it. For some of them, a reassuring medical examination is absolutely the heart of what they want, to check out that they're still okay, that nothing's damaged. But for others, it might just be talking to the play specialist about sleep, about relaxation techniques. For others, it might be knowing they can start a journey of therapeutic support. So it's really shaped that first appointment by the child and their family. But obviously, as a health service element at the Child House, we can provide things like STIs, whether that's for diagnostics or treatment, talk about contraception, consent, and also importantly, allow children to catch up on immunisations they might have missed. This is very key for children where they've perhaps missed school because of the trauma of what's been happening to them, or perhaps as a long-term history and background of neglect and emotional abuse. And so for some children, missing those immunisations will have happened just because they've missed school. The other thing that's really useful about the health service is to be able to consider not just the sort of forensic element of the examination, but actually the broader medical issues. And many children will come to us with other physical conditions, maybe related or maybe unrelated to the abuse, but that haven't been helped. And that can be really, really helpful for them to be able to support that too. So the therapeutic offer in the Lighthouse ranges from short-term support, one-to-one support for children, one-to-one support for a whole family, but also group work as well. And so whether that's through a peer support group like our young person's self-harm group, or whether that's through parent psychoeducation, these spaces where peers or parents can support each other have been incredibly valuable. And this was worked out with the support of the Crown Prosecution Service. You can imagine it's a very fine line between how we enable those parents to come together without impacting on the criminal justice process, without risking. And so they have a very clear consent process to not speak about their child's own case. But actually, they don't often want to go into the detail of that. What they really take value from is being in a room with another parent who's been through the same thing as them, and looking at them and seeing they are just another parent. The last aspect of the work of the Lighthouse is around safeguarding and contextual safeguarding and creating systemic support for that child and their family. So we often do a lot of work with schools, helping teachers think about how to support children who are coming back into the classroom after experiencing a trauma. We think about housing and keeping the children safe. When we talk more broadly around community safety, and work closely with our police colleagues if we see themes or trends that we want to bring to their attention. The service, as I say, was co-designed with children, and right from the outset, right back from 2015, when the model was first designed, there was a detailed work with children and survivors to really design who should even be in this child house, what would make a good service, what support do they think they would like. And as I say, that was when the caseworker, the ISVA role, came up as a really key part to navigate that journey with them. But they were heavily involved in the building design, right from the room layout to the fittings and furnishings and the resources that we have. Now that we've been running for 3.5 years, we have a very well established Young People's Forum. That is a space where young people that have been through the service can meet together 6 weekly with a couple of workers, partly to give them peer support, but partly also to allow us to speak to them about things we want to develop, ideas, and new things for the service. So, for example, we've had young people on some interview panels recently, which is really helpful for their CVs and their development, and incredibly helpful for us because they just ask the best questions. And then also involving them around designing lights, getting artwork for the lighthouse. We're creating a lantern to hang outside the lighthouse, which has been designed completely by the young people and is being developed by a local fabricator. It never ceases to amaze me how many people want to give help and support in these areas. So he's giving his time free of charge, which is just wonderful. We've also got a parent forum and work really closely with an experienced consultant. So Candice is a mother, but as a child was sexually abused within her family setting herself, and so really brings great experience to the other families around what it's like to be a parent. And I guess she can give to the parents an insight into what she would have loved and what support was really valuable from her mother. And so that's been a really, really profound piece of work. And Candice is now employed and as a core part of the team. The next thing we're looking to do is to involve the younger children, and so in the summer we'll be planning some young children's feedback day, really getting them creative and getting them involved. So this really feels like the golden thread that runs through the model for us. So I'll just play you here a little bit about what the children tell us.
Going to other services, I felt judged. The person said they didn't believe what I was saying and made me feel bad. The Lighthouse doesn't do things like that. They are very welcoming, always there to listen and never judgmental.
They don't go on and on about your experience. It's not all about what you have been through. It's more than just talk.
The rooms feel safe at the Lighthouse.
I was worried before I came, but you don't need to feel so anxious about coming here.
Every session can be difficult. Maybe ask your parents for help to think about how to talk about things.
The people here won't judge you. They are really chill.
After the first appointment, I wasn't sure if I wanted to come back because I thought there would always be so many people in the appointments, but there wasn't. Now it's usually just one person and me.
It's not about getting you in and out. It's in your hands how long you want the sessions to be and when.
The people are super friendly and sweet. I have received amazing help.
Sometimes there are lots of people in the first appointment. You can ask some of them to leave if it's too daunting.
It can be helpful to think about what you want from the Lighthouse before you come. Maybe plan what you might say.
Great. So, oops, what have I done? Here we go. So to tell you a little bit about what it's like working as a multi-professional team together in one building. I think what has been really interesting for me in the Child House model and looking internationally to see how it's done is there are lots of different ways of doing this. So in some jurisdictions, lots of different agencies physically work together in one building, but are very much separate agencies working alongside each other, but in a separate way. And I guess that's the way often in the UK we've done multi-agency working before. But one of the things I think that's been really unique about the Lighthouse has been bringing all the agencies together under one roof with one lead provider, one set of policies, one set of ways of working, one electronic patient record. So one place where all the different practitioners, regardless of their profession, document the care. And that single shared record has been incredibly valuable to be able to share information between each other. So it's not just the physical co-location and working alongside each other, but actually it feels like it's gone further. And we often talk about creating the Lighthouse way, and that's a continuous journey for us, something that we're still on all the time, thinking about how we want to work together, how we might bring together different language, different culture, different values, to create one way that we agree that we can all work together. so that the child and the family experience a bit like the swan sitting on top of the water, even if we might be paddling away underneath, working out how we're going to do things together. I've talked a bit about the benefits of being co-located, and that's helpful for the professionals being able to quickly go and seek advice around a medical issue as perhaps a young person that's suicidal. They can seek advice from the psychiatrist. A child that maybe makes a new disclosure, or what we think might be a new disclosure in a session, we can seek advice from the police liaison officers on site. A child who we might be worried about them going home that night, we can seek safeguarding advice from the local social care liaison officers within our team. So it's been incredibly valuable. But within that comes a need for clear roles and responsibilities. So you can imagine lots of the staff are able to do lots of the support for children, young people. And actually, to begin with, you just need to make sure you get that balance right between working together, but not stepping on each other's toes, but really acknowledging all the skills that everybody brings within the team. So it's been a huge journey, and a journey that I'm sure will continue for us. So I mentioned earlier about the safe space, and I think that is really key for us. It's something that allows children to move between services, and for that really ticks the box of children saying to us they don't want to have to keep retelling their story. So it means we can pop them between different services, and they don't have to come back and tell the practitioner. They know that the practitioner knows about them, and that's been really, really valuable. And as I said, for a staff perspective, it gives us the chance to meet and chat with each other about things. So I'm just going to spend this last piece just talking about child-friendly justice, and I guess what that means. The inspiration for the Child House in terms of child-friendly justice comes from the Barnhuset model, which is probably the most developed child-friendly model, much more than that seen in the child advocacy centres in America. And there are some really clear principles in a document called the Lanzarote Convention, which was ratified by the UK. And so it's something that we can actually hold on to as something that our governments have agreed will be delivered. Some of the principles that we follow in the Child House in London are that, as I mentioned, children should only have to tell their story once, as much as possible, to avoid re-traumatization. We're able to offer children and young people video recorded interviews in a really child-friendly suite called the Talking Room. You might have spotted on that slide before. And we're able to offer that interview led either by the police officer that's investigating the case, one of the Lighthouse psychologists, or a local social worker that's been trained in leading interviews. And there's really no specific reason why we may pick one or another. It's the person that has the best rapport with the child, or the person that brings the best skills in talking to children or young people, perhaps if there's a learning disability, a communication need, perhaps if it's a child that's very traumatized. And so we pick who might be the best person to lead that interview, as well as using registered intermediaries for children that are under 5, or if there's a very severe communication difficulty. And part of our model is around ongoing training and reflective supervision for those interviewers. So we really think that's an absolutely key part of the development, is being able to reflect back on interviews and learn with each other. So the 3-step process that children experience is the video recorded interview that I was just describing in the Lighthouse as their evidence in chief. And then 2 options at the end as it gets towards the trial stage. Either their cross-examination being undertaken via a live link at the Lighthouse during the trial itself, or more recently, since COVID has really pushed forward the rollout of pre-recorded cross-examinations under the Section 28 protocol, children since last November have been able to book the Lighthouse to pre-record a cross-examination under this methodology. Now, as with all things criminal justice, it takes a little while for everything to move through the system, but cases that went to ground rules hearings late last year are now booked in March to come for their pre-recorded cross-examination. So this is the talking room, either used for the video recorded interviews, or you can see there the screen, which is the live link to court. Now, one of the things that we've spent some time designing is our children's advocacy team have created a great resource called Conversation Bags. So you can see some of the items there that go in those conversation bags. This is really to help the judges be able to get to know the young person and to meet them online just before the live link or the video recorded interview. And one of the reasons for developing these bags was because the judges felt nervous about not meeting a child face to face in person, or a bit nervous about meeting a young person or child online. And whilst we did our very best to reassure them and talk to lots of children to check it out with them, that actually for the young person it would feel quite normal. For the judges it was sometimes something quite new, and so we created these little bags where the judge and the young person can pick something out of the bag, and just as a bit of a conversation starter. You'll see some different things there, some conversation cubes or some dice, or perhaps some of the flip cards that show how they might be feeling that day. And I guess importantly, what difference has it made? For the young people, they would tell us it's made them, given them the best chance to give their evidence. You can see there, one young person said, giving evidence is doing something massive, and doing it in a place where you feel comfortable may give you the best possible chance. Another one said they thought more young people would come forward if they knew that they could have their interview at the Lighthouse. She said, I promise you there'd be lots more cases. And it's interesting to note that as we looked at the final evaluation of the Child House model, that actually victim withdrawal was one of the things that really reduced. So still 31%. So still a number of children that don't want to proceed with the criminal justice process for whatever reason. But that's dropped significantly from 45%. Better evidence, meaning more suspects are arrested. And really, really importantly, 24% of cases being submitted to the Crown Prosecution Service for a decision compared with 10. Now, when we know that it's perhaps less than 2-3% of cases that make it through to a trial, to prosecution and conviction, for me, that is a huge, huge step forward, that we've got a quarter of the cases that come through the Lighthouse have sufficient evidence to be able to go forward to the Crown Prosecution Service. And we're hoping to repeat the evaluation data in a couple of years, so we can follow the cases right through to the end and see the difference it's made to the charging or the conviction rate. The other important system change we noticed is that early investigative advice is now asked for in 21% of cases rather than 6%. So this is officers speaking to the Crown Prosecution Service early on, and that's been a hugely important development role for our police liaison officer, really changing practice in their colleagues and drawing together the closer working of the local police and the Crown Prosecution Service. The other part that we do is really help unblock some of the things that reduce case delays. So disclosure of notes is a classic example, something that can often hold up investigations for several months. And we've been really working closely to make sure that all notes are released within 30 days. So finally, just to think about sustainability, it's often the way when a project is funded with some central government funding, we might think, well, how do we actually make sure this continues to the future? And what is it that we can continue to do with this model? We're really keen that everything that we've learned at the Lighthouse is used to help other people as they're trying to set up similar services, or even taking elements of this service as you create something that's local and relevant to you. But for us, what's really important, I think, and what we would love to see in other parts of the country is something that's local, that really builds on your local providers, partners, skills, expertise, some way of pooling together your commissioning and your funding so that it's many agencies commissioning and many agencies delivering, but actually pooled together in some way. And we believe, really importantly, identifying one safe space. And that may be a brand new building. It may be an existing SARC that's grown and developed. It may be some space, you know, on the edge of a local authority or a health building. It may be a residential house. Each area has taken a different approach, but that one single safe space for us feels absolutely critical part of it. So finally, just to end in terms of showing you who's been funding this Child House model. So in the pilot, you can see quite a bit of central government funding from the Home Office, from MOPAC, from NHS England, from Department for Education. But we're really pleased that we're now moving forward with sustainable partnership funding from our local specialist commissioner, so the budget that comes for SARCs, our local police and crime commissioner, some charitable funds from the NSPCC, our integrated care partnerships, so our health and care commissioners, and the Crown Prosecution Service. So it's really, really good to see that breadth of funding. The only gap down there at the bottom is the local authority, which we will continue to work on, because it would be fantastic for us that all the agencies that could benefit from this service are part of the sustainable funding going forward. But this model now has been taken up locally in North London and is now recurrently funded, which is absolutely brilliant to see. So I'm just going to end by asking my colleagues that are running the event just to show you a very short film. It should just be a 1 minute, which will give you a virtual tour around the lighthouse. Thank you very much.
Everyone deserves to feel safe and respected. When sexual abuse happens, everything can seem dark and confusing. It can be really hard to talk about, even though it's not your fault. The Lighthouse is a safe place where you can talk about things that happen to you and make sense of them. The people here are here for you, to help you feel better and figure out a way forward. There's no rush, there's no pressure. Whenever you're ready, we're ready.
Fantastic, thank you, Emma, and thank you for your amazing presentation. It's really, really promising and really awesome to see that you've now got sustainable funding going forward as well. So that's fantastic. We haven't had many. Oh, we've just had a question now in the chat. We've had a comment from Claire Lepetz that victim withdrawal rates show emphasis is still on victim-led approach, great data and interest to see the outcomes that are monitored across the agencies. We've had Sian from Betsy Cadwalder saying that you mentioned that you see children after 3 days. Could you outline why this decision was made and what arrangements are in place for acute CSA cases, please?
Yeah, great question, Sian. I guess the reason for that is just a very practical and logistical reason. To be able to provide forensic examinations, you need a big enough physical space to have a forensically clean suite of rooms, which we didn't have in our building that we were able to secure. But also you need 24/7 cover to be able to undertake those examinations quickly, those forensic ones, when they need to be done. And so the approach that we took in London was that because we had a really great SARC, in the Havens, which is the London SARC, and it had a children and young people's service that they undertake. It's probably about 1 child a month that needs that very urgent forensic examination, and then they come back to the lighthouse for their follow-up. But all the others just come straight to the lighthouse because they can wait till the following day or, you know, a couple of days after that. So it's just a practical reason. If you in Wales were creating a model something similar to this but based around your existing SARC, then you could do it together because you would already have that cover for the adults.
Thank you, Emma. And we've had another question come in from Lucy Winterston. Brilliant service. Is there any way to refer into the lighthouse?
Oh, I'm afraid not. I think we're a bit far away as well. It just serves 5 North London boroughs at the moment. And we provide consultation advice probably a little bit more broadly around North London. But yeah, I'm afraid that's it.
Thank you. And I think that is the end of our questions. If there are any further questions that come to mind, please pop them into the chat and we can ask Emma to respond after the event, if that's okay. But thank you again, Emma. That was a fantastic presentation. And we look forward to continuing to work with you in Wales and trying looking at the principles of the Lighthouse and how we can implement them in our children's SARCs here. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll be moving on to our next presenter. So we're now going to be moving over to the NSPCC for a presentation on harmful sexual behaviour, evidence and learning from the work with children, families and professionals. And it's Helen Gazzola and Jenny Nicholson. So over to you both. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Let me just share my screen and hope that it works. I'm going to share this one and then I'm going to put this. Oh, hang on a minute, I've done it the wrong way around. Sharing the wrong screen with you, sorry. That one. Okay, can you see a screen with a front side on it now? Can somebody just unmute themselves and let me know?
We can see it, Helen.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, oh no, I've done it again, sorry. Okay, so going to talk to you today about harmful sexual behaviour and about our work and what we've learned really across the how many years, 6 or 7 years that the Scale Up unit has been working across the UK with areas to improve their provision for harmful sexual behaviour. So to tell you who we are, what we do, very, very quickly. The Scale Up unit of the NSPCC was established around 2015 to take services that we had developed internally, evaluated, tested, proved they work, and scale them externally, essentially with the aim of, you know, spreading the impact, improving outcomes for children and families. And we've always had a theme, a child sexual abuse theme within the Scale Up unit. So the services that we are currently scaling up around child sexual abuse, harmful sexual behaviour framework, which I'll touch on a few times while I'm talking to you. Change for Good is a therapeutic intervention for children who display harmful sexual behaviour. Letting the Future In is a sexual abuse recovery intervention, one of the things that is used at the Lighthouse. And Safe Home is a service that is just coming through our evaluation at the moment. That is a safety planning and support service for the parents and carers, kind of a system around kids who display HSB. So that one will be coming into scale, I think, this summer, if all goes well, if the evaluation is as positive as we are expecting it to be. So that's who we are, that's what we do. I'm Helen, I am the Associate Head of Implementation, so I manage the unit, and Jenny, my colleague, is here with me today. She's one of the implementation managers that works across the CSA theme. So I wanted to start with this, and I'm not going to read all my slides, don't worry, through this, but the first two I am, just because they're definitions and they're quite wordy, so bear with me. I wanted to start with this and to ask you to think about a condition or a disease affects 1 in 5 girls, 1 in 7 boys before they reach the age of 18. It can cause erratic behaviour, severe conduct disorder among those exposed, can have profound implications for future health of a young person, increases the risk of substance abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, suicidal behaviour, and it replicates itself by causing some of its victims to expose future generations to its effects. What would we do if it existed? We'd spare no expense, we'd invest heavily in basic and applied research, and we'd devise systems to recognise and identify those affected and provide services to support them, provide services to treat them and help them recover. And we would develop and broadly implement prevention campaigns to protect our children. Everybody would be concentrating on this. Everybody would be working to support children and young people. That's child sexual abuse. That's why we're all here. What we're going to talk about today, I want to make very clear, it takes away in no way from the importance of supporting survivors of sexual violence, of CSA. Absolutely. Through lots of our work, we support that. But today we've been asked to talk to you about harmful sexual behaviour, our experiences of working across the UK with it and what we've learned. So that's what we're going to concentrate on. The definition that we work to at the NSPCC is from Hackett. So the important things here: behaviours expressed by children and young people, so developmentally inappropriate behaviours, and may be harmful towards self or others. So there is harmful sexual behaviour where there is no person affected other than the child who is displaying the behaviour themselves. And the thing that, you know, is really important to remember here, and one thing that we see an awful lot when we start working with areas, is that harmful sexual behaviour for a lot of professionals initially, it's that ultimate final crime. It's that really serious sexual assault, that rape. It's not. It's really important to remember that there are a continuum of behaviours here, and that there are developmentally normal, appropriate behaviours that children will undertake that are perfectly normal. It's right for children to be curious. It's right for children to explore themselves. That might make some adults and some professionals very uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that it's not within the normal range of development. And the other thing I think it's really important that we all remember, and we really encourage areas to remember when we're working with them, is that, you know, when kids are exploring anything, they get things wrong sometimes. One instance of inappropriate sexual behaviour does not necessarily mean that a child is going to go on and display HSB again and again and again. You know, the context might be wrong. They might be doing something that's appropriate at home, and in the safety of their own room, they might be doing it in the wrong context. Kids get things wrong when they're exploring, and it's really important that professionals remember that behaviours aren't ignored, but they are looked at in the round, and, you know, considering where that child is at and how frequently a behaviour might occur. So yeah, continuum of behaviours there. Before we get into a little bit more detail about HSB, I just wanted to go over some of the things that have happened in the last sort of 5 or 6 years in terms of learning and developments around HSB. So NICE issued guidelines in September 2016, and we released the framework same year. There was a new definition of CSE released 2017, but it still didn't really address that interface between CSE and HSB, that overlap that a lot of you will see. It didn't really talk about that. So there is still an awful lot of confusion that we see about that. Obviously, the Home Office funded their Centre of Expertise. There was the Australian Royal Commission and ICSA work. That work's concluded now, but, you know, that is kind of ongoing, and the learning from that is still being looked at and brought into practice. So I'm going to touch on the framework in a little bit more detail later, but just it's kind of the root of where our work in this area came from. It's where the NSPCC started looking at this. And the reason that we did was because this is what we saw when we were looking at, you know, kind of doing the scoping exercises that an organisation like ours does when it is looking at where is a gap, where do we need to work, where is the need the greatest. This real lack of consistency around all kinds of things, and I'm talking lack of consistency at a strategic level, so a strategic local level, but also at a national level, at a regional level. You know, real lack of consistencies around policy, around provision, service provision, lack of consistency around response. You know, we still see that. We see a lack of consistency around response even within teams, let alone within local areas or within regional areas. We see a lack of consistency in response to HSB within two people in the same team can respond completely differently to this behaviour when we first start working with areas. Real lack of consistency around awareness and knowledge, responses, everything follows on from there. And that it is changing now, but we still, when we start working with areas to a greater or lesser extent, there is still that issue there for them. So this work was a collaboration. The framework, pulling together the framework, was a collaboration. It remains a collaboration. It always will be a collaboration. We learn something from every single area we work with. We learn something from every single time we do this and people ask us questions. But we very much brought together, you know, most of the players within CSA in terms of the third sector, academics, research, police, government agencies, various people involved. And we also worked with 14 local areas who fed into the work, as in giving us a real picture of what it was like for staff on the ground, what it was like for people dealing with these behaviours, what awareness they had, what support they had, what provision they had. This was the feedback from the 14 local areas. This was a real summary of the feedback. And for me, and Jenny will tell you this as well, it's no different. If I would hope if we were in a room together and I could actually see you all, there'd be some nodding heads here. But this is where a lot of areas are when we first start working with them. So that real lack of training and support for staff across the lead agencies. And I'm not necessarily talking about staff in specialist services. They have the knowledge, they have the training. It's staff in universal services. It's people who are going to be on the front line, dealing with these kids every day, dealing with these instances as they happen. Not having the training, not having the support, and not having the confidence and the, I suppose, the space to ask questions and to figure out, you know, am I doing this right? Is this the right response? Touched on inconsistent responses. We get that everywhere, that you know, children are treated differently depending on who is dealing with this case within the same agency. And again, that goes back to training, support. It goes back to awareness and understanding and confidence in dealing with these things. So that's where we're at. That's where a lot of areas of the UK are at when we start working with them. And it's sad for me that we are still there, and that a lot of areas are still there, and that people are feeling like that. It's really stressful working with some of these kids. You know, we've been in meetings and had teachers talk about vomiting before they've been into classes, because they know that a certain pupil is going to be in the class, and they know the type of behaviour that potentially is going to show itself. It's a really hard thing to deal with some of these children, and dealing with them in the right way is so important for their future and for obviously all the people around them. It's a real balance of risk against need. You know, we really need to think about the risk that these young people present. It's really, really important that that risk is managed. It's really important that the people around those young people are protected, be they other young people or be they adults. It's really important that risk is documented, that the right language is used, because there are instances where these behaviours will be repeated and repeated, and they will escalate, and that recording is very necessary. But it's also really important to look at the needs as well. And what we see a lot is either the risk being very downplayed, you know, oh, it's just kids, they'll grow out of it, we don't need to do anything about it, or the risk being massively overplayed and focused on at the expense of everything else. We don't see as much as we would like to the needs of these children being addressed, looked at and considered. And we're going to try something now. I don't know how well it's going to work because obviously you're a virtual audience, but Jenny is going to talk to you a little bit about an incident that we've pulled together from lots of different cases that we use, and ask you to comment in chat on a few things. So this is also a test if you're still listening to us, I suppose. But Jen, are you around to unmute yourself if I flip to the next slide?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Yeah, so we're just going to give you some information about a particular incident, and we would like you to think about this incident in terms of harmful sexual behaviour that takes place, and also the risks and the needs of the children involved in the incident. So we have a 14-year-old male, and there is an incident that takes place in the toilets at school with a 14-year-old female, where the male attempts to force the female to give him a blowjob. This then resulted in an argument, some conflicts between both of the children in the toilets. Eventually, staff in the school broke up the argument between the two, and immediately following, the female then disclosed what had happened in the toilets to the teaching staff, and that threats were made to her as part of the incident as well. So school have been aware of other incidents of inappropriate behaviour displayed by the male in the past, but this is a clear escalation from previous behaviours. So the previous behaviours, in terms of the previous behaviours, no referral or support has been put in place before this, other than reporting to the parents.
Okay, so in terms of this, obviously the female needs support, she needs to be believed, she needs to completely understand that this is being taken seriously, but for the purposes of this, let's focus on the male. And I don't know, can you see chat, Jen? Is this going to work?
I can see the chat.
Okay, so in terms of the risks, what have we got to think about? What have we got to take into account here? What risks are we looking at? Jenny, I'm going to rely on you to tell me if anybody's
yes, nothing so far, but as soon as something pops up, I will share. His well-being, Bethan said his well-being needs to be taken into account.
100%, yeah.
Lucy said forcing sexual acts.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk, isn't it? And there's a huge risk around his peers, you know, if this happens again.
Yeah, Robin, harassment of a serious nature, and the others popping through now. Risk of reoffending and becoming violent, the risks he presents to others, pattern of behaviour, issues for him around understanding.
There might be an education issue there, mightn't there? There might be consent, might need some education around consent. Yeah,
and there's some very pertinent comments around what is the male's family background, that both children should be considered victims. So that is being brought in as well in the comments. So thank you everyone for those.
Fabulous. So we've kind of gone on to needs a little bit anyway, haven't we? So yeah, what about his needs? What might be going on for him in terms of what do we need to look at here in terms of what he might need to support him?
We've got one thing. Has he got any additional learning disabilities or needs?
Yeah, really good.
He may be suffering from some form of neglect or abusive behaviour at home.
Brilliant, yeah.
A couple in terms of is there any abuse taking place in the home? Lisa said he needs to be educated around sexual behaviours, so appropriate sexual behaviours.
Yeah.
Maybe he's not aware of what appropriate sexual behaviours are. Has he witnessed anything at home that could be in a violent or abusive household? references to exposure to pornography or him having experienced any ACEs in his life. And really kind of things that Deb said, what in his life experience he may need the opportunity to speak about, like what's going on at home and understanding where, you know, what's going on in his life.
Absolutely. It's really actually really encouraging to see all that. We don't always get such a response that is so understanding of what's going on for him. And yes, you're all absolutely right. I'm going to move now to some slides about what kind of experiences are prevalent among children who display harmful sexual behaviour. So it's quite often the case that people will automatically assume that children who display harmful sexual behaviour have been sexually abused themselves, and evidence shows us this is the case for around half of them. That percentage goes up a little bit the younger the child is, but some work Hackett did shows that these other kind of childhood traumas and abuse are prevalent for around 2/3 of children who display harmful sexual behaviour. And you all know the backgrounds. You know that there can be multiple factors present here. So these are the kids that, you know, there's been emotional neglect from when they're very little. They're the kids that aren't picked up in the cot. You know that NSPCC ad of the child crying in the cot, nobody comes for them. They're those kids. They're the kids that haven't really had appropriate boundaries at home around anything. Somebody mentioned exposure to pornography before, domestic abuse, that real kind of situation, you just don't want any child growing up in, really. Multiple kind of ACEs and traumas in their background. That is the reality for a lot of children and young people who display HSB. And it often is the case that professionals that are dealing with them, you know, school, are already aware of a lot of this going on for kids, but they're not always. Sometimes the HSB is the first indicator. And, you know, it's really important to remember to find that balance. Yeah, we need to deal with the risk. We need to look at that. We need to manage that, and we need to make other children safe. But also, let's look at this behaviour and think, where did it come from? What's behind it? You know, there is often a very clear escalation in these behaviours. When we're looking at younger children under 12, much more likely that they're going to have been either sexually abused or live in highly sexualized environments. So exposure to sexual activity of their carers, exposure to pornography, violent content, that kind of thing. It's more likely the younger the child that they've been exposed to more of that. And then looking at children with learning difficulties, somebody mentioned in chat earlier, you know, is this young man got learning difficulties? Children with learning difficulties are disproportionately represented when you look at children who have harmful sexual behaviours. And the additional factors that may be linked to that, you know, lack of appropriate sex education, them not being given that sex education because people are assuming that they won't understand, and also a lot of behaviours being minimised and attributed to the learning difficulty. They tend to be much more impulsive and opportunistic, but also less able to maybe manage that themselves. The way I always think about it with children with learning difficulties is you can have say a 14-year-old in chronological age who might socially, developmentally relate to a 7-year-old, to other 7-year-olds. That's their peer group. But they're still in the body of a 14-year-old. They've still got the hormones. They're still physically developed as a 14-year-old. I mean, we all know what's going on in 14-year-olds' bodies, don't we? And all the hormones going haywire. That's still happening, but they relate to younger children than them. So they are a group that is disproportionately represented when we look at HSB, and also really poorly represented when we look at support for them in terms of interventions and what's out there to support them. So that's some of the kind of issues behind what's going on for kids with HSB. But what about the prevalence? What about how often it happens? I'm I'm not going to ask you in terms of 15% of all sexual offences against children in the UK are true or false. I think I've got from what you were all saying in chat before, you probably all know that's false. Does anybody want to pop anything in chat and give us what you think might be a more accurate number? Sexual offences against children and young people committed by other children and young people. Are you getting anything in chat, Jenny?
Not just yet, but my lots did pop up just several seconds after you asked me last time. So. Oh, we got 30%.
Yeah, okay.
80%.
80, oh, okay.
30 to 40%.
Okay. So yeah, you kind of, it's really, really difficult. Obviously, it's going to depend on which figures you look at. And this is recorded sexual offences rather than convictions. We go for between 33 and 66, looking at the research that we look at. So we go for around a third of sexual offences against children and young people are committed by their peers, by other children and young people. The other thing that we all know in terms of sexual offences is the ones we know about are the tip of the iceberg. We don't know about them all. This is just a slide I use when we're looking at prevalence and we're looking about why is it important that we deal with this? Why is it important that we kind of record HSB and we respond to it as early as possible? Simon Hackett, who I'll talk about a bit later, did some research with Durham Police, and they tried to get chronologies of 10 adolescent males who'd committed serious sexual offences and were in secure accommodation because of it. They could only get chronologies, full chronologies for 8 of the young people. So 8 boys, 78 instances of HSB recorded in records of those 8 boys. And all those 8 boys were able to escalate to commit a serious offence that meant that they ended up being convicted and been put in secure accommodation. 38 of those offences were identified as sexual offences. All victims were female. So the fact that these instances have been recorded, 38 sexual offences recorded, but all these 8 boys were still able to go on and commit a more serious offence. That for me is why we do this. You know, if we work with those 8 boys, if we identify that behaviour sooner, we support them, we work with them, we educate them, look at what we stop, look at how many victims we prevent, we protect, as well as improving the lives of those 8 boys and the family around them. Reoffending rates. So most children and young people who commit harmful sexual behaviour, they don't go on to become adult sex offenders. We know that, most of them don't. But a lot of them do go on to commit other offences that might be considered antisocial. So that's one of the reasons why we know that the kind of HSB interventions that work best don't solely focus on the sexual behaviour. They focus on broad-based behaviours, they focus on developmental goals, they focus on, do you know what, look at the background most of these kids have come from, let's work across the board at their behaviour overall and their understanding of appropriate behaviour, and yes, some of that is around their sexual behaviour. Current research suggests that around 3 to 12% of children who are treated, who get support for their HSB, go on to sexually reoffend. So it's a really, you know, a relatively low number. And we also know that the earlier the intervention, the more likely it is that there won't be any reoffending. So one of the things that we see a lot as well with HSB is that confusion that, you know, when we initially work with local areas, I mentioned earlier that there's the tendency to see that harmful sexual behaviour as that kind of final really serious sexual offence rather than the continuum of behaviours. There's also a lot of confusion, a lot of kind of overlapping between CSE and HSB. And this document is included in the framework. It's kind of the wider circle is all kind of things that are present in all types of CSA, so that misuse of power, coercion, lack of consent. And then we have CSE, generally a teenage victim, often female, often relationship-based offending. And then HSB, often a child victim, you know, a child victim same age or younger than the child committing the behaviour. Mixed gender, often familial, you know, there's an awful lot of familial HSB that we see. And then that's where they overlap, peer-on-peer abuse. And from the start of when we've shown this diagram, professionals come back to us and say that overlap needs to be bigger. Hackett did a dip sample not long before lockdown started, so I don't know if the research has been published yet, but he looked at cases in Durham again of CSE. About 66% of them had elements of HSB in there. So what can that look like? These three very strange photographs. So the one with the young girl kind of looks like she's crying with the, I think, male behind her. Violence in teenage relationships. Awful lot of that going on. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that. An awful lot of expectation among young people that there will be violence, there will be sexual violence in their relationships. The young girl leaning against the railings, you know, she's there to represent young women who are groomed, coerced into situations of sexual exploitation. Absolutely a victim herself, 100% a victim herself. Maybe then coerced into going out and finding other young women, other young people to join and to be made available to these groups of people that are exploiting her as well. And then the hand, the Addams family hand, always reminds me of the Addams family. That's looking at online offences that start online. Again, we all know the need to protect children from online grooming, contact with sex offenders online. Often it's their peers as well. It's not just adults doing this. So, quote from ICSA, moving kind of seamlessly into online offending. No issue more pressing for contemporary child protection than the role of the internet in facilitating CSA. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, and we don't have huge amounts of research around this yet. We don't have huge amounts of evidence. But what we are seeing is that profile that we were talking about earlier and those risk factors for children who are committing, let's call it contact HSB, not always present with technology assisted harmful sexual behaviour, not always the case. A few composite cases for you that represent what we're seeing. 14-year-old boy, grade A student, affluent family, no agency involvement, no history of any of the things that we've just talked about before, no evidence of any of that in his family, no concerns about behaviour, high performing student, small group of friends. His HSB online is massively sophisticated, coercing images from same age females, whole range of fake online personas, significant impact on the victim. Nothing would give you any indicators of that in his kind of profile. Another one, slightly more kind of evidence for this. Early onset use of pornography, youth conditional caution for sexual assault of a sister at the age of 14. But look at what he's saying. He wanted to try out what he saw in pornography. It's really important that we remember that children or young people don't have an online world and a real world. It's all one world. We're hearing that increasingly around harmful sexual behaviour. I wanted to know what it felt like. I wanted to try it. I wanted to see. And they're getting their cues from pornography. And we all know that pornography isn't necessarily representative of consent happening and that kind of thing. So yeah, technology assisted harmful sexual behaviour is of real concern and a real emerging area. And we now work at NSPCC from the point of view of we assume all harmful sexual behaviour has a technology assisted element with it. We used to work with, we're assuming this is contact and let's explore if TA's there. We're assuming now that it is there for every single child because that's how kids live, that's how they learn, that's how they explore. We're ruling it out rather than ruling it in now, I suppose. So let's think about the framework and think about what is out there, what can you use, what can be helpful for areas in dealing with this. So framework is a research-based document mainly based in Hackett's research. If any of you fancy some further reading, this is kind of the Bible for HSB, the kind of document that holds most of the current research, and any of Hackett's research after that as well is really useful. I've talked about the Durham stuff. He's very, very much focused on harmful sexual behaviour, so there's always other stuff coming out. His continuum, I think, is something that a lot of people will be very aware of. But that is really kind of the evidence base and the thinking that we use with the framework, that children don't go through a continuum. You will very, very rarely get an instance of HSB that we would describe as violent without having had a range of behaviours before then, without having had an escalation. So you know, let's use that. Let's try and identify it as early as we can. So the way the framework works, it covers 5 domains. It's a free to download resource that Jenny, I think, is going to post a link for you in chat. It covers, and it's not a guide for working directly with children. It's a strategic guide for an area to look at. How are we dealing with this? How is our multi-agency workforce dealing with this? What do we need to change? So each chapter is a summary of the latest evidence, thinking, an audit section with statements to help you assess your current practice, and principles to consider when focusing on delivery. And it's aligned with the NICE guidelines. And we updated it in 2019, again with Hackett. Slide that flashes. This is what the audit tool looks like. Again, it's part of the framework. It's free to download. They're good statements to kind of rate yourselves against. We do have a support package that works with local areas to support them through this audit. Unfortunately, that bit of it is chargeable. We have to cover our costs, but the tool itself is free to download, and hopefully the link is there for you. What we're trying to do with this work all the time is encourage self-sufficiency and make dealing with harmful sexual behaviour, raising awareness of harmful sexual behaviour, kind of business as usual. So, you know, we encourage areas to look at the audit, look at an action plan, look at a plan that's going to really improve practice. It's not quick fix this. You're not going to fix things quickly when it's looking at a strategic area and how you approach it. Sorry, I have to apologise. I've got a Labrador downstairs who's just decided to bark. One of the perils of working from home, if you can hear him. Training, you know, let's look at training locally. Let's look at really skilling up the universal workforce. That's what we're looking for there. And we obviously encourage as well knowledge exchange and looking at the best interventions out there. But the one thing that we do know massively, nobody can do it by themselves. No agency can solve this on their own. It does not matter if you've got the best interventions in the world, if you've got the best specialist services. If HSB is not being recognised in universal services, it's not being recorded, you're not getting the referrals, those interventions are useless, and vice versa. You've got an amazingly aware universal workforce, it's all being recorded. You're the only area in the UK that we've worked with so far that when we go in could give us a clue of the prevalence, because nobody's ever been able to do that with us. But there's no interventions. Again, children are going to fall through the net. A couple of other things that might help. I'm sure you've all heard of the Brook traffic light tool. If you haven't, it's brilliant. It is behind a paywall now. You have to access Brook's training to do it. However, it's really good training, and it's a tool that, you know, we know people find incredibly useful. Looking at a public health approach to HSB, and this is what we really, really encourage areas to look at. Look at your awareness and training, look at your e-learning, look at your existing workforce, but also look at your emerging workforce. Think about how you can skill them up. Think about how you can make it business as usual. Think about how it's something that happens every single year. Your secondary prevention, you know, what are your assessments like? What are your risk assessments like? What's your safety planning like? Are all the children that need an assessment getting one? Are the recommendations made after assessment? Can you address them? Can you meet the needs that are identified in an assessment? Is there some kind of consultation service? Kicking back to primary prevention, you know, can people working in universal services, can they pick the brains, for want of a better word, of people to check that they're doing this right, to develop their own understanding? And then tertiary prevention, you know, what are your interventions like? What are your specialist interventions? Are the specialist interventions? Are they only available for children and young people who've gone through a criminal justice route, or is there a way that children and young people where the decision has been made not to pursue a criminal justice route, can they still access an intervention? In many areas they can't. You know, think about that whole approach about every single child that has any incident like we've just described earlier. What happens for them? Is there something available for them? Another tool, beyond referrals, in terms of contextual safeguarding, and this tool is aimed primarily at education. Again, I'm hoping Jenny's going to slot something into chat for you. It's a traffic light tool. It works. There are two available. One is for a school to look at themselves in terms of an internal context and how they're doing. You just rate yourself against a traffic light. And then the other one is looking at the school in the wider context in terms of the kind of community around the school. How do you rate? But it's been piloted. There's a ton of webinars available on the contextual safeguarding website as well for beyond referrals at the University of Bedfordshire. Free tool to use, access it, use it. Yes, aimed at education, but useful, I think, for other sectors too. And then some development work that we did with the NHS and a resource that's available on NSPCC Learning, free to access. We were approached by the NHS in 2019, the NHS in England, and initially they wanted an HSB framework for health, but that wasn't what was going to work. So what we developed is a range of pages that are available on NSPCC Learning for looking at how health can contribute in the most productive way to a multi-agency approach to HSB. Yeah, it's got a health focus, but I think it's really useful for all agencies and all sectors. Have a look at it. There are various resources like this one on there. This overlays Hackett's matrix for harmful sexual behaviour with some advice on how you might respond at a strategic level. It obviously doesn't have local detail in there, but it's looking at how you might respond to HSB on a strategic level. There's all sorts of resources on there that you can download. We designed them to be downloaded, printed, stuck on walls, taken out with you, used in kind of helping people to respond better to harmful sexual behaviour. Looking at what is still of concern to us. I've mentioned a bit of it. Lack of responses, lack of provision, lack of resources for children and young people with learning difficulties, not just in policy and practice, but in provision, in service provision. Lack of educational resources for them as well. Lack of, well, not lack of, but our learning developing in terms of HSB. When we first started working with harmful sexual behaviour, quite often treatment models that were used with adult sex offenders were adopted, and there was the assumption that children who displayed HSB would display the same behaviours as adult offenders. There'd be the same manipulation, the same grooming. Things have moved on now, and we know that's not the case, but we are still learning. It's very much an emerging subject, an emerging issue. So still that fragmentation massively, that overlap between HSB and CSE is really not understood. I think because there's been so much training, quite rightly, in CSE, there's the kind of tendency to always label it that, and once it gets recorded in a system as one thing, does the HSB then get overlooked? Assumptions about technologically assisted HSB. Real lack of primary prevention measures, and this is something that for us is a huge gap. What we see again and again and again in areas is, even if referrals are being made, even if HSB is being identified, and even if areas have a therapeutic intervention for HSB, there is nothing happening for the children that do not meet the threshold for a referral to a specialist service. So staff in universal services can see the behaviour escalating. They are making repeated referrals, but the behaviour is not yet serious enough for them to meet a threshold for a service. Those kids are falling through the net everywhere. I'm fairly sure they're falling through the net in areas of Wales as well. Every single area that we've dealt with, there is this lack of services, provision, resources for supporting children with what we would term problematic sexual behaviour. They're not meeting a threshold for a serious, for a therapeutic intervention yet, but the behaviour is causing serious concern already, and there is an obvious escalation. There's nothing, there is no provision out there for them. We're working on it, we are developing something, but you know, they're just left in limbo at the moment. They are just left in limbo, and it's really, really concerning, because we also know that the sooner we intervene, the sooner we support them, the more likely they are to have successful outcomes. And that, I think, is the end of what I was going to talk to you about. I think I'll finish on saying that the thing about this work that is the saddest, I think, for us, and I think Jenny will probably agree with me, is that quite often when we work with local areas, we are reacting. They are reacting. It's because there's been a really serious sexual offence committed. It's because a serious case review's happened. It's because, quite frankly, at strategic level, people have had the living daylights scared out them because something awful has happened. And they realise that they are not equipped to deal at a strategic level in a multi-agency way with these kids. We're brought in then. That's when people contact us. It's a reaction. And what I would really, really love to see is that this behaviour, this kind of issue is dealt with more at prevention stage. Let's prevent the need for that. Let's you know, download the framework, use it, use the resources, set systems in place before it becomes a need that is so pressing because something so shocking and so awful has happened. You know, let's prevent rather than react, I suppose, is the message I'd want to leave you with. I think I've been talking now for about 45 minutes. So yeah, that was all really that we wanted to talk to you about today and say, and I'm quite happy to take any questions if there are any in chat, Jenny.
There's no specific questions, but I just wanted to kind of pick up on a couple of just thank yous for the comments and say, I know Sam Clutton has shared a number of links about wealth policy in Wales and links to the NICE guidelines whilst we've been talking. And Sam also said regional safeguarding boards have an action in the National Action Plan on preventing and responding to child sexual abuse and to promote and provide learning on HSB to practitioners across agencies. And then also Ali raised a really pertinent point about the Estin report. So looking at the Estin report recently, which shows a huge percentage of girls experience sexual violence at school, we have to take into account society that encourages male entitlement and role of pornography in young males cannot be dismissed. And then Lisa just shared the challenges she has around her experiences working with a young person who may not admit to the behaviour and how challenging that can be as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we have a lot of conversations with areas at the moment, because there are some areas when we start working with them, they say that they they will only offer a therapeutic intervention to young people if a young person admits that the behaviour has happened, that you know, they recognise that they've done something wrong. I mean, how many kids do you know that will do that? Really, doesn't matter what the behaviour is. You know, I think we have to work with this in a different way, and absolutely, in terms of the comments earlier about the Estin report and the violence and the abuse that young girls are reporting that they experience. One of the things that shocked me to the core when I first started working with this was how frequently, through audit evidence and through talking to young people, they'd be saying they expect violence in their relationships. They expect to be forced to give people blowjobs, and they expect to be hit because that's what their last boyfriend did and that's what all their mates' boyfriends do. That real kind of viewing of sex as a violent act is really prevalent among young people. And yeah, we have to stop dismissing behaviours. We have to stop going, oh, it's just boys. Yeah, it's not just boys. Some of them will never escalate. Some of that behaviour will never get more serious, but some of it will, and that's about the messages that we're sending to, you know, to adolescent males. So yeah, 100% agree with you. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm quite happy if people want to take themselves off mute as well. I don't know if that's allowed. Sorry, people that are organising it. No? Okay. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you both. That was a really, really informative presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I think, from the comments, lots of other people felt exactly the same. So thank you. Thank you both. Just to pick up on two other little bits that have come in on the chat is we've had something from Sam Clutton, who said the Welsh Government is developing an action plan on tackling sexual harassment in schools in response to the issues raised in the Eston report. And Cecile has come in to say that in England there is research being commissioned into the impact of pornography on young people, and the NSPCC would like to see something similar carried out here. So thank you all for your chat, and you made it interactive, which was fantastic. I know we talked about it before, and we weren't quite sure about the interactive, but no, it was amazing. Thank you both. So what we'll do now is we'll have a break, just a comfort break for everybody to grab a cup of tea or coffee, and a quick toilet break. So if everybody could please come back at 11 o'clock, so we'll have a 15-minute break. There'll be a holding slide on in the meantime, and we'll come back to some presentations from the CSA. Thank you all. Hi all, and welcome back. I hope you've all managed to grab a quick coffee in the break. For the second half, we'll make a start shortly with our next set of presenters. We've had a couple of questions in the chat about sharing of presentations and recordings. So there will be an email sent out and links sent to our webpage where we will be sharing a recording of the session. So on to the second part of our morning then. So I'm very pleased to introduce Nikki Evans and Natasha Sabine, who are practice improvement advisors from the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. And also May Baxter Thornton, who's a Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel member for the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. And they are going to be presenting on child sexual abuse, how to improve your practice for survivors, both children and adults. So thank you very much. Handing over to the three of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Can I just clarify that you can see the screen and that it's up there?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
That's brilliant. That's absolutely fine. Wel, bore da pawb, hyfryd I fod yma bore yma a diolch am y gwahoddiad I ddod I siarad gyda chi. Thank you very much for the invitation this morning to come and speak to you. We're absolutely delighted to be here this morning. And as Jo said, we're from the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse, and we have 40 minutes to do a real whistle-stop tour with you, really. But we thought we would probably start out because for some of you, you may not ever have heard of the Centre of Expertise before. Now, in our previous session, it was alluded to, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of context. We were set up by the Home Office following the whole in the wake of that public and policy recognition about child sexual abuse, when the national scandals really started to hit the society's sort of awareness. So the challenges of Rochdale and Rotherham and Oxford and Telford, but also Jimmy Savile, Gary Glitter, there was a swell of understanding really that there was something really massive going on here. So the government at the time initiated two pieces of work. The first one was the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, and the other one was to set up a centre of expertise on child sexual abuse. And our purpose really is pulling together a multidisciplinary team. We're hosted by Barnardo's, but funded by the Home Office, but we're actually separate from both. And our role is to promote and disseminate good practice around child sexual abuse. And actually, when we first were established in 2016, there wasn't much cohesive research around at that particular time. So today's session is really just about looking at it at a practical point of view. We wanted this to be sort of a practical session. Now, I was going to pick back there. I just want to put a little bit of a health warning out there, really, that when we are talking about child sexual abuse, we've been doing this work long enough, and those of us in the field know this, that it is very likely that there are people within the group today, within the audience today, who have themselves been victims of child sexual abuse, or certainly know friends or family who have been. And it's one of those subject areas that does require sensitivity, and it requires us just to be mindful of taking care of ourselves. Some of this material can be difficult, as we heard in the previous session. So we're just putting it out there. Please just be kind to yourself today. And if today's not a good day to listen to this stuff, then so be it. Okay. I'm going to literally do a whistle-stop tour. We had prepared a little bit more, but we've had to sort of cut that back a little bit. But it's going to be the bare bones, but I just want to sort of give you the baseline. What are we talking about when we're talking about child sexual abuse in terms of numbers? And this is a baseline figure that the Centre has published in its more recent Scale and Nature publication, where 15% of girls or young women and 5% of boys or young men will have experienced child sexual abuse. And that kind of works out to that more than 1 in 10 children has been sexually abused by the age of 16. So we are talking significant numbers of children and young people. This is not a small number. This has got sort of major implications for us as a society. I'm going to draw your attention to the iceberg model, really. And I want you to have a look at the bottom line in the dark purple there, where it says quite clearly that there are estimated 500,000 children across England and Wales every year who are being sexually abused. Okay, these are enormous numbers, and when we look at sort of the numbers in Wales, they're not there at the moment. Yes, 25,000 in Wales. So proportionally, the numbers are still quite big. But as you go up that iceberg, you look at the next level, and that you'll see that nearly 88,000 are actually reported and recorded by the police in England and Wales. So of that 500,000, only 88,000 actually get to that point of being reported and recorded by the police. And then as you go up that ladder, you can see that children assessed at risk of sexual abuse in England, we don't have the figures for Wales on this, then gets less and goes down to 30,500 nearly, actually being assessed. And then when you get up to the final line, you'll see that of that 500,000 children who are estimated to have experienced some form of sexual abuse, only 2,600 children in 2019 were on a child protection plan under the primary category of sexual abuse. So we really wanted to flag up that there are an awful lot more children who have been abused who have never come into our radar or on our agenda. Okay, when we look at the Welsh figures, you'll see then that 25,000 in Wales, 5,097 reported and recorded by police in Wales in 2019, and only 221 children were on the child protection plan in Wales under that primary category of child sexual abuse. So this is really tip of the iceberg numbers, and that's the message that we want to get out to you today. I'm just going to flick through these because I want to focus on Natasha and May's presentation really, but we do want to frame this session in everybody understanding that child sexual abuse is no less common in Wales than any other form of childhood sexual abuse. It's just that it gets hidden in amongst emotional abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and it is almost sort of comparable with children who witness domestic violence as well. But the worrying trend is when you actually see just how low down and how the small numbers are actually recorded as sexual abuse. So before I sort of just finish the introduction, really, just want to give you some headlines. We know that there are far more children in Wales and across England who are being sexually abused than we're currently identifying and safeguarding. That is known. We know as well that it thrives in secrecy. The more we talk about it, then the more likely it is that we are going to be able to help stop it happening. Okay, and we know that the majority of sexual abuse happens within the family environment. Over half happens within the family environment, and that includes family and friends. And so for us looking at sort of child sexual exploitation outside of the home, that makes up a much smaller proportion than children who are actually being abused intrafamiliarly and within the family setting. Wanted to flag up to you as well that the centre is really proud. We've been working hard for a number of years to develop resources that are for practitioners, that are really practical resources and guides. They're also available in Welsh. And we now have out there the 3 resources: signs and indicators, which covers behaviours of the child, physical signs, behaviours of those around the child, and the environmental signs, supporting parents and carers, and then communicating with children, which is a fantastic resource. And Natasha is going to speak to you about that particular resource this morning. I'll put all these links in the chat so that you're able to sort of directly access these resources after the conference. And finally from me really is just to bring to your attention that I think after next week, they're going live next week, and to thank Welsh Government for supporting this here in Wales and for supporting the Welsh version of these videos. We have got 3 sets of videos which can run sort of concurrently and alongside those 3 resources really, and they are both in Welsh and in English. So they'll be on YouTube, and we will be disseminating that information out to you. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to hand you over to my colleague Natasha, who is going to talk to you about our Communicating with Children resource.
Thank you very much. Oh, I can suddenly hear myself. Might be. Nikki, could you mute so that I can't hear myself, please?
I can hear you.
Yeah, but I could also hear myself.
All right.
Which is not ideal. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, as Nikki just said, thank you very much for having us. Picking up from what Nikki was just saying then, I'll talk to you a little bit about the Communicating with Children resource. I will talk particularly around some of the kind of key features of that, some of the reasons that we at the CSA Centre thought that this was something that was really needed, thought that this was something that would help improve practice in how we start to have some conversations with children and young people where we're concerned about sexual abuse, particularly thinking about the figures that Nikki just presented then, and thinking about some of the challenges in identifying children and young people who are experiencing child sexual abuse. What we know is that one of the biggest challenges that we face is concerns about how we start these conversations. If we're worried about children, we might have identified that there are particular signs and indicators, but we know that often professionals across the kind of multi-agency network often find challenge in starting these conversations, in how do we start to talk to children when we are concerned. We felt that there's quite a lot that's kind of sat in the space of what we shouldn't say. So consequently, we often hear professionals saying, but we can't contaminate a police investigation, or we can't ask leading questions. What we wanted to do was put something in the space of that helps us all to think what we can say, what things is it okay to say, how do we encourage children to feel confident and comfortable to start to have those conversations with us. So thanks, Nikki. Excuse me, Nikki's controlling my slides, so I will be having to say next slide, please. So next slide, please, Nikki. Cool. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to start particularly here in thinking about this quote that's on the screen now. So there were so many times when I thought about telling someone, but it was just like, how do you bring it up? How do you walk into a room and go to somebody, oh, by the way, this happened? I think this is a really powerful quote because it identifies to us that there are many reasons, and I'll talk in a second about some of the barriers, but there are so many reasons why it's just very, very unlikely that children will be able to start to have these conversations with us, that will be able to tell us. We talk a lot about disclosure. I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding that as a process in a second, but I just wanted to highlight from the beginning that for many reasons, it is often incredibly difficult for children to tell us what is happening to them. I'll talk to some of those barriers now. If you could just move to the next slide, Nikki, that'd be great. So why is it difficult for children to start these conversations? Well, lots of reasons. I'll talk about some of them, but there are many, many reasons why we can't expect children to be able to tell us when they're experiencing sexual abuse. For lots of children, language will be particularly significant, and for a number of reasons. So some children may not have developed spoken language. So for very, very young children who haven't developed spoken language, they will have even less ability to be able to start to communicate their experiences. Some children who may have developed spoken language, but for example, if they don't communicate in the language that we as professionals are communicating in, then there can often be real challenges there in how to get those messages across. Some languages, in some languages, there are not the kind of direct translations for particular words, so it can be really difficult for children to be able to start those conversations. Many children don't recognise their experiences as abusive, particularly for children who may have been sexually abused in the home. Sexual abuse may have started at a very young age, but also for children who are sexually abused in schools, for example. It can often feel like, we know from some of the reviews recently, that for some children it can kind of feel like this is just what happens. This is what happens in this particular environment. We know that shame and embarrassment is a significant factor for many children, and often children will really worry about what other people will think, what will it look like, how will it sound, how will I share this incredibly personal thing, how do I start to talk about that? We know that those who sexually abuse children will often use threats or manipulation to prevent children from being able to speak, or to feel that if I tell somebody, then I will have to leave the home. My parents will be really upset. They will be impacted. My family will struggle. Children will often really fear these consequences, and will often feel that actually the consequence of speaking out is often worse than the consequence of not saying anything. And for many children, they feel responsible. So those who abuse children will often say things like, if you didn't look like that, sound like that, behave like that, and to lead children to feel responsible. What we know, as I was just saying, is that it's very unlikely that children will tell us. This particular report in 2013, No One Noticed, No One Heard, showed that it took 7 years on average for young people to disclose. The younger the child was when the sexual abuse started, the longer it took for them to disclose. Interestingly, over 80% remember trying to tell someone. Many of these disclosures, unfortunately, were either not recognised, they weren't understood, or particularly challenging to read. They were dismissed, they were played down, they were ignored. A really shocking figure, I think, 90% of those young people had had a negative experience at some point. So we really need to think that children need help to tell us. Children need help to communicate their experiences. I mentioned earlier, we often think about disclosure as a one-off act, as a one-way process, where a child tells us everything that's happened to them in one piece of information, in one situation, in one discussion. We know that very, very rarely happens for the reasons that we just mentioned. So it is absolutely key that we recognise our part in this process. So we recognise that we have a significant role to play in this process. What we know is that actually disclosures develop through an interplay between the children's signs and expressions and the reactions of adults around them. So if we notice something in a child, if we notice that a child appears to be displaying signs or indicators of sexual abuse, it's absolutely our responsibility to act on that and start these conversations. Children may tell us a little bit of information. They're going to often be watching the way we react. If we react in a particularly shocked or negative or a way that that makes the child perhaps think, you don't believe me, or I can't share this information, or this information is too much for you to handle, they're not likely to say any more than that. So it's really important to recognise our role in this process. So what is difficult? Why is that sometimes difficult for us as professionals? What stops us talking to children about sexual abuse? We worry about getting it wrong. We worry that it's a difficult conversation to have. We worry about what we'll say. We often hear this, what if I open a can of worms? How will I deal with it? What we've heard from a number of survivors of child sexual abuse is that they're already living in that can of worms. So asking in a sensitive way is not going to make that worse or more difficult. We worry about saying the wrong thing. As I mentioned earlier, we've worried for a long time about contaminating evidence or asking leading questions. There's often also this worry that what if the cause for my concern is just part of a family's culture? We often worry it's not our job. We hear that so often, you know, that's not my role, that's somebody else's role. What we do know is that there isn't somebody else there. There isn't somebody else whose role this is. And one of the key messages from today that I really want to give is anybody that is working with children and young people can and should be able to have conversations with them about sexual abuse. We worry it should be somebody in a specialist role, and that just isn't the case. I've mentioned worries about contaminating evidence. I'll just wait for the next thing. We worry about how parents will respond. We worry that, will I give the child more information? Will I tell them something they don't already know? And as Nikki said at the beginning, and as we've heard through the morning, this is an emotive subject. It's difficult to talk about, and we worry about that, I think, often as professionals. So what skills do we need then in order to be able to have these conversations? This is one of the core elements of the Communicating with Children resource, and we talk lots about what skills professionals need in communicating with children. What you will see really clearly there is these are skills that we all have. So if we can develop trusting, empathic relationships with young people, if we can be honest, we all know that children and young people will often pick up if we're not honest. They really just want us to be our authentic selves. So if we can bring our authentic selves into these conversations, that's key. If we can remain responsive, reassuring to children, very clear in our interactions, self-awareness is absolutely key. We will all bring something into our conversations, and understanding, appreciating, accepting what we as professionals bring to these conversations is really important. You will notice as you read through Communicating with Children, there are various reflection points throughout that. These are really important because they ask us to look at ourselves a little bit and ask us to look at what we bring to these conversations. And cultural competence is absolutely key in making sure that we remain responsive to children and young people and families that we work with. So what can we do? We can, and I'll talk a little bit about each of these in a little bit more detail before I hand over to May. We need to notice. So this is where our signs and indicators template comes in. We need to be looking out for, we need to be asking the question. We need to notice that if we have got concerns about a child, we need to think about how we build a picture of those concerns. We then need to think about speaking to the child about this. We need to prepare for our conversations as much as possible. Sometimes that isn't going to be possible. You'd be in a situation where you just don't have the opportunity to prepare. But as much as possible, we need to think about where we'll have these conversations, how, when. Then we need to speak to the child, we need to engage with them, and then we need to record what we are concerned about, what we've done, what the child has said. So I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. A really powerful motivator for children and young people is for us to notice. So when we notice the signs and impact of a child the child may be displaying, and we ask about them. And we absolutely do have a responsibility to start those conversations and to notice if things are difficult for a child and ask. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about the sorts of things that you might be able to ask. Thanks, Nikki. So thinking about preparing wherever possible, and as I mentioned, you may not have the opportunity to do this, but think about what barriers this child might face in talking to you. So you've got your picture, you've done the signs and indicators template, you've worked on your you've worked through your kind of concerns, you've built this picture of concern. Now you're thinking, I need to speak to the child, and this is really important. So thinking about what barriers does this child or might this child face in talking to me, and how can I overcome them? You might want to think about where, and we've heard something this morning in terms of places and spaces and how we create spaces where children feel safe and comfortable. Think about language, how will we communicate? What sort of times do we need to have these conversations? Where can we have them? Who should be having them? It may not be that it's the person with the safeguarding responsibility that the child trusts. So important that we recognise, respect and respond to who the child's trusted adult is and support that person to have these conversations. So then thinking about what we can say, really important. I just wanted to make mention again that we can't underestimate the importance of preparing in terms of how the child speaks. If the child doesn't use spoken language, if the child communicates in other ways, it's so important to find people around the child to understand, how can I best communicate? And if I'm not the best person, who is the best person to give the child the opportunity to communicate? All too often, I think language can be used as a barrier that can't be overcome, and this can't be the case. We have to work to overcome and to do as much as we can to find ways to communicate. So some of the things we can say then, commenting rather than interpreting. So I noticed statements are really powerful. I notice you crying. Open a door to communication. I'm here. One of the things that we do avoid, suggest avoiding, is the why question. It can sound quite blaming. So you might need to say, or you might want to say, why are you worried about going home, for example? You might choose to reframe that. So avoiding the why question, you might choose to say, what is it that you're worried will happen if you go home? Thanks, Nikki. I'll just give you some examples. I'm mindful of time. All of this is in the Communicating with Children resource, which we will share. Just want to give some really practical examples here. So this slide demonstrates the graduated approach. So dependent on your level of concern, you might want to say, I've noticed you don't see yourself at the moment. I'm here if you want to talk to me. That might be enough to open a door to communication. It might not be. You might have, your level of concern might be such that you need to be a little bit more direct. So I've noticed you don't see yourself. Can you tell me more about that? Again, that might be enough for the child to start to speak to you. It might not be. You might need to be a little bit more direct. So then you might say, sometimes things happen that children find really difficult to talk about. And so you can see there that you're opening a door, you're starting with these kind of really clear, I've noticed you, I see you. Then can you help me understand a bit more about what's happening? And then being a little bit more direct, moving on from that. Lastly, I just wanted to mention recording. Really important that we, and you will all know this, I'm really sure, but I just wanted to make mention, so important that we record in the child's words. Even if a child uses a word for something and you absolutely know what that means, so important that we always use the child's words, and clearly, accurately. And just to kind of end on, we often worry about recording concerns about child sexual abuse in case we're wrong. It's really important. We absolutely can record that we're concerned about a child experiencing sexual abuse. It may be one of many hypotheses, and it's important to recognise those as well. As long as you say what you're going to do about it, then recording concerns about child sexual abuse is really important. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to May now.
Thanks, Natasha. Yeah, hi, I'm May Baxter Thornton. As you saw in the agenda, I'm actually work for the on the Victims and Survivors Consultative Panel for the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. But I also do work for the CSA Centre, and I am one of their trainers. So I actually train professionals in 2 courses, intrafamilial abuse and working with adult survivors as well. So my work on the inquiry is as a consultant, so it's a paid consultancy where basically we look at all kinds of things, including reading reports before they're published and commenting on them. Everything from how the Truth Project was worked from beginning to end, lots of things. But I'm here today, I've been asked to attend today, mainly to share with you my experiences of child sexual abuse. Can you put it back a second, Nikki, just so I can give my kind of intro. Basically, I was born Melanie Jane Williams in Aberdare, so my accent might sound a bit weird, a bit weird. I lived in the northeast of England for like 18 years of my life, but I was born and raised and now still live in Aberdare in Rhondda and Taff. And I was sexually abused growing up by my father. So, you know, trigger warning, you know, I am going to speak about child sexual abuse, obviously not anything graphic, but I am going to speak about it because it is important to speak about it. I don't remember exactly how old I was when the abuse started, but I remember that I had to reach up to open a door. And the reason that I remember that is not because I was trying to escape anything, but because that's when I started closing people out and shutting people out, and isolating myself because of that abuse and because of that lack of trust. It went on until I was about 8 or 9, I think, but again, I don't know exactly how old I was. And, you know, my memory from that time has been really badly affected. I've had people walk up to me in the street who went to school with me and sat next to me every day for years, and I have no idea who they are. So I'm here today to speak about some of the challenges I've faced, but also some of the ways in which I think that could help you to work with survivors of abuse. My father was an alcoholic, and the first time I drank alcohol, I can't remember how old I was, but the first time I chose to drink alcohol, that it wasn't given to me by someone else, was about 13 or 14. So I have now stopped drinking alcohol, and I don't partake in that anymore. The main issue that I've had is with dissociation. And I think that started from a very early age, from about the same time as I was shutting people out. So dissociation can come across as somebody daydreaming, somebody who can't concentrate, somebody who's constantly looking out the window. I remember I always used to be doing that. And you tend to find as a child who dissociates that actually you end up getting told off for it quite a lot, because you can't concentrate very well on what people are saying to you. And when you do, you're not thinking about that anyway, because your brain is kind of elsewhere. The dissociation doesn't just happen when the abuse is happening. When it starts from a very young age, it can happen all the time. That's just something to be aware of, especially if you're working with children and adolescents who are experiencing this. They may come across as quite disrespectful and not able to concentrate on you, constantly looking for the door, you know, that kind of thing. And it's nothing personal to you. It's just, for me, it was a form of dissociating. So I recently had EMDR that really helped with that. And I now don't do it as much. And when I do it, I am aware that I'm doing it. So you can kind of overcome dissociation with the right help and with the right therapies. And over the years, I have had several therapies, cognitive behavioral therapies, counselling, you know, and the EMDR, like I mentioned. So at the age of 22, I went to university in Sunderland, and that's when I moved from Aberdare to Sunderland. I was there for about 18 years. And during that time, I started volunteering at women's refuges, and I've worked in the field of domestic abuse as well. I've been a support worker, working with teenagers. I worked in a project that was for 16 to 19-year-old young women when I was 23, 24, and I was very similar to them, I think. But I knew their environment, and I was able to work in the environment, which again, I think those types of very pressurized environments that you all work in, that you have to have certain amount of skill in kind of being used to that, I guess, and to dealing with it when it can be quite a stressful place to be. Yeah, so if you want to go on to the next slide, Nikki, thank you. So some of the challenges I've experienced, isolation, I want to say a little bit about that because, it comes into the lack of trust that is also up on there. But, I isolated myself, and luckily I like my own company, so it wasn't, and I dissociated, so I was daydreaming a lot of the time, so I was quite happy in my own little world. But when you isolate yourself, your communication skills suffer because of that. So you kind of struggle to have those conversations that a lot of what you've heard today, professionals and people expect young people to be able to have. So people expect young people to be able to disclose those kinds of things to you, and that's not always the case. And by isolating yourself away from that and from other people, other young people as well as other adults, that can prevent you from being able to find the words or have the language to disclose. I also had a big fear that I would do something wrong. So I was very, very timid as a child. The young Melanie that is me probably would never imagine speaking to over 100 people today. But there is this constant fear that you're going to do something wrong. And that comes from, being told that, you'll never be able to do anything without me. If you do say something bad, things are going to happen. And you're constantly told those things by your abuser and sometimes by other family members, because my father was very domestically violent. He was abusive to everyone in the household. I don't know if he was sexually abusive to anyone else, but he was abusive to everyone. And therefore, people just didn't want to do anything to upset him. And therefore, he had everyone like puppets on strings in the house. So it's not that people collude with the abuser, but when you're in that environment, it is hard to stand up to them and to say things that, that might upset them or might put you in the firing line. So I constantly had a fear that I would do or say something wrong. The dissociation I've mentioned, lack of trust in almost anyone I've mentioned, lack of confidence in my own abilities. So I remember little things like being in primary school and getting picked for sports and playing rounders. That kind of thing would set me really anxious. And, the fact that somebody was going to pick you to actually do something was quite stressful, and it would induce worry and panic attacks and anxiety. I was actually a grade A student, so when people say, that people don't do well in school, that's not always the case. Sometimes people go the opposite way and throw themselves into education, and I've got degrees, and I'm a trainer, and I can function in society, so a lack of confidence in my own abilities when I was younger was really, I worked hard to kind of overcome that. I needed a lot of confirmation from others of my own skills and abilities. And I luckily have had key people in my life throughout my life, starting with the director of Wayside Women in Need when I started working for them, who gave me a lot of confirmation that I could do things and a lot of support and encouragement. And even the CSA Centre now still do it. Nikki still does it. Natasha still does it. So there's that confirmation of my own skills. The need for permission to undertake everyday tasks. If you'd have asked me when I was a child what my favourite colour was, I couldn't have told you because I didn't know, because I would have needed somebody to give me permission to say that. And so when you're working with children, when you're working with young adults or adults as well, they may not be able to answer such open-ended questions as, what do you think about this? You know, people need permission to undertake those kinds of things. And physical ailments. I've had eczema and skin conditions from a very young age. And if you think about how young I was when the abuse started, because I must have been, as an adult now, I think I must have been a toddler. I must have been very, very young. So I suffered, and I get eczema still today. I've only just recovered from a batch of it on my arm. Osteoarthritis at 35 and asthma at the age of 40. So these anti-inflammatory conditions can come on, and a lot of it can be caused by stress, a build-up of stress over the years. So next slide, please, Nikki. Thank you. So now I'm just going to, because I work for the inquiry and because I don't know if you're all aware of the Truth Project data. The Truth Project was a project where survivors could tell the inquiry how they were let down or failed by institutions, and in order to try and shape what the recommendations will be when they come out. And of the Truth Project, over 6,000 people who came forward to the Truth Project, 45% of them said they had illnesses or conditions that affect their daily life. So if you're working in the NHS, if you're working in health services, if you're working in mental health support, people will have other ailments, other conditions. So you may be working with someone because of their arthritis, but there may be underlying other issues that cause them stress. So these are some of the long-term impacts that child sexual abuse can have, and this is data, research data that's been found by the what the Truth Project have disclosed. So 88% of people who came forward said that they had an impact on their mental health, and I would back that up. I've suffered from severe depression in my past, although now not so much. 37% of the victims reported depression. 54% said it impacted on their relationships and intimacy and abilities to trust, which I also mentioned, so it kind of backs up what I'm saying. And the impact on school and employment. Now, a lot of people do struggle with school, but a lot of people struggle with school because they maybe weren't in school, or because they're sorry, somebody's knocking my front door now. Can you imagine when I'm speaking? I'm just going to leave them. So the impact on the education can really suffer as a result of people keeping them out of school when they were children and things like that. So there's a 31% impact on sexual behaviour, avoidance or phobic reactions. People can also be promiscuous, and there are other ways that people can behave, but it has had some kind of impact on them. Impact on their physical health, as I've mentioned, 12% of all people who came forward to the Truth Project, all 6,000 of them said musculoskeletal conditions, and 9% went on to commit minor offences, as mentioned. Thanks, Nikki. So what would have helped me when I was growing up? Here's little me. Here's the little me you would have seen in the late 70s, early 80s. Medical staff could have been more attentive because I was in and out of doctor's surgeries for minor things quite a lot. School teachers could have been more attentive. You see a little bit of a pattern here. More aware of the signs and indicators that aren't the child disclosing. And adults generally around need to be more aware that children are still children. I put a smiling photo on there because I wasn't always unhappy. And, my father was the person who abused me, but I wasn't always worried and anxious and sad around him, because it's the same person that gives you Christmas presents and Easter eggs, and it's the same person who is abusing you is taking you on holidays and doing fun stuff. So just be aware of that they are still children, so that you can be aware of the signs and indicators. don't be afraid to put the words child sexual abuse on paper, as has been mentioned. You know, even if there is neglect and physical abuse and other things happening, please don't be afraid to document child sexual abuse. It's really important. Sorry, Nikki, next slide. So working effectively with adult survivors in planning, delivery, training and shaping policy. I wanted to say a little bit about this because I've been involved in a number now of consultations and paid work as well by the CSA Centre. I was involved in the development of the guides for communicating children and for working with parents. And I've also obviously paid work with the inquiry as well. But try not to be tokenistic or use survivors in one-off consultations for things, because I think it is important to have ongoing involvement and ongoing development. You know, be aware that something you might have planned might need to be changed, that, you know, survivors might come up with a better way of doing it or a different way of doing it, and just to be aware of those things and to be open to them as well. Be open to people guiding you on how services should be developed, and show you value their input by paying them for their time. And I have been involved in some Welsh Government stuff where I wasn't paid for my time. I just attended meetings and got paid for the transport to get there. But to expect voluntary involvement, really, if people are working, for one, and it's during the day, they can't attend. So you're only getting a small section of survivors who maybe aren't working individuals. I just wanted to say that really at the end, to finish off my little bit of this. And there are a few more slides which Nikki can, if you can, I will run through them very quickly. So it's more information about the CSA Centre. So there are training courses, dedicated training courses on things like intrafamilial abuse, harmful sexual behaviour and sibling sexual abuse. There's also a new Working with Survivors resource that I've been working with Nikki on. Yeah, if you want to skip forward, Nikki. So some of the key messages, you will get a copy of these slides. I'm not going to read through them now just for the matter of time, but there is a newsletter. The CSA Centre has a newsletter that you can sign up to. So you can search it online. You can just Google, or the link is there. You'll get it in the resources. It is really good. It tells you all new practice guidance and stuff that comes out. And if you've been affected by anything that I've said or anything that you've heard by any of the speakers so far today, there are some helpline numbers and some information that will come out with our presentation as well. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. All, and thank you to you, May, for sharing your experiences with us. And thank you to Nikki and Natasha as well for your presentation. I think you've seen in the chat that everybody found the entirety of the session really informative. And yeah, they're popping up now. So thank you all again. And we'll definitely be sharing your slides and the information that was shared in the bar as we go through. I haven't seen any questions pop up. So unless there's anyone that's got any questions for Nikki, Natasha or May. No, I'll give you 2 seconds. No, just lots of thank yous. So yeah, okay. Fab. We will we'll go on then to the next set of speakers. So we now have a presentation on working with child trauma, a staged approach, and this is from WSAS North Wales. So I'd like to introduce Gillian Clark, who's a counsellor and trustee, and Leah Bradshaw, who's a support worker. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. I was going to say good afternoon, but we haven't quite made it to the afternoon yet. So good morning, Bore da. So as Joanna just said, my name is Gillian and I am a counsellor and trustee with WSAS North Wales. And my colleague Leah is with me today and she'll be looking at the chat. So if you do have any questions, then we will look at those at the end and hopefully answer those for you. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we do today. So is it possible to have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we're going to aim today to provide an overview of RASAC and the services that we offer to our children and our young people. I'm going to give you some statistics and to provide a brief information on following how to help us work in trauma in an informed way with our clients. So we'll look at what trauma is, PTSD, CPTSD, attachment and ACEs. So ACEs are, you're probably all aware, adverse childhood experiences, and some of the therapies that we find useful that we use in a staged approach to working with those children and young people. Next slide, please. So at RASAC North Wales, we cover the whole of North Wales, which includes the 6 counties within it. So we cover Anglesey, Gwynedd, Conway, Denbighshire, Flintshire and Wrexham. We do provide counselling and support. We supply group therapy to parents, to children, to male groups and women survivor groups as well. And as you've just already heard from May, we contribute to these groups on the writing of these presentations, but we actually ask our survivors to help us, because these are the people that have been through these experiences and they are best for us to promote it in that way. We do work with any age, we work from 3+ for male, female and children, and welcome everybody into our service. Thank you. Next slide, please. So to access our service, you are required to have an initial assessment with us. This covers all about the client. So we discover what's happened to them. We discover if there's any medication, if they're working with people. And what's really important with therapy is we need to know if they've been to trial or if they're about to go to trial, so that we can work with them in the best way for them to help them access it. Our waiting times at present are 4 weeks for both our children and our adults, which is absolutely superb. So it's a very short waiting time for a child to be seen. Our counselling sessions are 60 minutes, they're weekly, and our counsellors contract for 8 sessions. And we have actually worked with some clients for up to 12 months, because the way that we work is in a person-centred way, and that does require a further exploration of what that child could be going through, or that adult. We are very fortunate that we have 4 counselling rooms in Bangor, but when I say we're fortunate, we're very lucky that we work with some other agency who provide counselling rooms for us across North Wales, so that we're able to access those clients wherever they may be. So obviously, even more fortunate now with the fact that we've got onto Zoom and telephone, we can access people who are in remote areas, which is really important that these people have a voice and they have that support that is available for them, and to be able to talk through what they've been going through. Thank you. Can I have the next slide, please? So just some information about children, which I'm sure that you've probably heard today. In total, in 2019 and 20, we had over 3,715 recorded offences in Wales. This included rape, online grooming and sexual assault against children. This represents a 107% increase since 2014. More than 10 children a day are victims of sex offences in Wales, and these figures do come from NSPCC Cymru. So these offences come from family members, they come from strangers, and they people to come in close contact with. And I don't have the percentage on me, but the majority, unfortunately, are family members that abuse the children. Thank you. If I could have the next slide. So what is trauma? So trauma is an emotional response following stressful or frightening, distressing event. If I could just have the next slide. Thank you. So this could be from accident, rape, war, or a natural disaster. And these events happen at any time and at any age. So they could be from the moment we were born to the moment, that we're in our 80s or 90s. And some of these effects are long-term lasting effects, which we've just heard from May as well, where she was discussing. And these are physiological and psychological effects on young people. And these do contribute to PTSD and CPTSD. So that's the complex part of PTSD. They also include some longer term reactions. This includes unpredictable emotions like anger, the flashbacks, and does cause strained relationships, and psychological symptoms, which could be headaches and nausea that some of these children do talk about to us. These are signs that are long lasting and do show daily in children. So what are the differences between PTSD and CPTSD? So if we could just go 2 slides, that would be brilliant. Thank you. So PTSD can be developed immediately and after going through a single traumatic event. This has been a term that was more commonly used for war veterans or if someone had been involved in a car accident. And many years ago, a war veteran would have been described as a shell shock. The difference for PTSD and complex PTSD is it can come from a serious accident, an instance of physical or sexual assault. It can come from a traumatic childbirth experience, such as losing a baby, and it could have a serious health problem that may be required being in intensive care. So if you could just pop the next slide on for me, please. Thank you. It can develop immediately, but it also can develop, which is important to know, is it can be developed weeks and months or years later. And PTSD affects 1 in 3 people who have suffered a traumatic experience. And I think it's important to note here that PTSD, which I have just said, doesn't come on at the beginning. It can be developed many years later. So the next slide, please. So complex post-traumatic stress disorder, this is more likely to affect survivors of rape and sexual abuse, and it is a new term and may not always be recognised. It's developed through traumas experienced at an early age. The trauma lasted for a long time and was repeated. It could happen because they couldn't escape, that was impossible, and the client experienced multiple traumas, or even if the client was harmed by someone that was close to them. Symptoms for complex post-traumatic stress include feeling of shame and guilt, difficulty controlling their emotions, periods of losing attention and dissociation, headaches, dizziness, chest pains, and a lot of times cutting herself off from friends and family, so becoming quite lonely to look after ourselves. Thank you. The next slide, please. So with regards to that, then we do look at attachment. So John Bowlby was a psychiatrist and paediatrician who worked on the bond between a mother and child, and this led to his attachment theory, which has profoundly influenced just not psychotherapy but parenting styles around the world. So if I could just have the next slide, thank you. So Bowlby went on to describe attachment as a lasting connectedness between 2 human beings. So for working with children, Bowlby's theory is absolutely important to understand that attachment between children and how we work with them as therapists. So he developed 4 main types of attachment. And if we just go on to the next slide, we can just go through them. Thank you. So the 4 main types of attachment that Bowlby discussed was the ambivalent attachment, and this is where children become very distressed when a parent leaves and children cannot depend on the primary caregiver to be there when they need them. This is considered the uncommon, affecting between 7 and 15% of children, and these children cannot depend on their primary caregiver. So whenever I see the ambivalent attachment, I always think of leaving my child at nursery and always seeing them in distress. But it's just that's completely different to this attachment style. This is where we then don't meet the needs of that child. The avoidant attachment, this is where children tend to avoid parents or caregivers, showing no preference between a caregiver and a stranger. Children who are punished for relying on a caregiver will learn to avoid seeking help in the future. This normally is a result of abusive or neglectful caregivers. We see this a lot with children that we work with within RASAC, and that's due to the fact that, as I said earlier, a lot of the trauma has been experienced by a family member, so they do avoid, and that can be quite difficult to get to when we're working with those children, to get into that attachment style and get them to trust, which is what's the basis of our work. Disorganised attachment is children displaying a confusing mix of behaviour, seeming disorientated, dazed or confused, and parents may serve as both a source of comfort and fear, leading to disorganised behaviour. This is linked to an inconsistent caregiver behaviour. And then the secure attachment is that children who can depend on their caregivers show distress when separated and joy when reunited. And when frightened, securely attached children are comfortable seeking reassurance for caregivers. So this is where we'd hope that most of our children would be, that they would fall in the secure attachment area. But as we know from today, that isn't the case. Thank you. If I could have the next slide. So ACEs, and the next slide, please. So adverse childhood experience or traumatic experiences occurring during childhood that cause children to repeatedly suffer. These experiences can directly harm a child, for example, abuse, or can indirectly affect a child through the environments they live in. So growing up in a house that has domestic violence. The resulting trauma can continue to affect people as adults long after it has happened, as we've discussed today, with those flashbacks and those repeated memories of what's happened. So some examples of adverse childhood experiences are domestic violence, parental abandonment through separation or divorce, a parent with mental health condition, and being the victim of abuse, physical, sexual or emotional, being the victim of neglect, physical and emotional, a member of the household being in prison, and growing up in a household in which all adults are experiencing alcohol and drug use problems. Thank you. If you could just pop on to the next one. So for every 100 people in Wales, 50 have experienced one ACE and 14 have experienced 4 or more. And trauma situations can be sexual, substance, domestic violence, and if left without interventions can lead to a range of issues. So there are just some of the things that somebody might go through from birth to death across that life course and that lifespan. Thank you. So if you could just go on to the next one. So when children are exposed to these adverse and stressful experiences, it can have a long-lasting impact on their ability to think, interact with others and on their learning. And ACEs should not be seen as someone's destiny, and there is much that can be done to offer hope and build resilience in our children, our young people and our adults who've experienced adversity in early life. And that is, as you've heard today, through those talking therapies, that intervention and that group work. And for us to be able to spot it as well as people who are out in the community, as teachers, as doctors, as nurses, scout leaders, that we spot what's going on for these children and get some intervention in there as quickly as we can. Thank you. The next slide. So we're working with our children and young people. There are stages and assessments, and as I said earlier, children for us are classed from age 3 to 18 years old. And how we work with them are at different stages. So our first stage to work with children is through our assessments. If I could just go on to the next slide. Thank you. So we would look at the theories around trauma to help us work with those children. And there are several trauma theories. And a couple of trauma theories are evidence-based and feature in the NICE guidelines. And these are the trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy, focusing on 3 phases, which is the stabilisation, trauma narration and integration consolidation, eye movement, which is the EMDR, and treatment consists of 8 stages in EMDR. So it's the client history, the treatment planning, client preparation, assessment, desensitisation, installation, a body scan and a close and a re-evaluation. And there are also several non-evidence-based therapies from 3 different theorists here, Curtis, Herman and Chu, and they again are similar as they use 3 phases which are summarised as having a beginning, a middle and an end. So Curtis looks at the early phase, which is an establishment of those treatment parameters, and then it's really important for him that he's discussing the development of the therapeutic relationship and that working alliance. And it's so important that we're able to get our children to realise and begin to trust us in that therapeutic relationship and start to work with us. In that early phase, again, with Curtis, it's the maintenance of that personal safety and that relative life stability, and it's development of additional sources of support and attention to self-functions and symptom management skills. In the middle phase, we start to decondition, we graduate and control that exposure to that traumatic material, and we can start to mourn. So we get the child to mourn what they've gone through, and some resolution and integration of that trauma. And at that late phase, it's the self and the relational development and the life reconsolidation and restructuring for that child. Herman likes to look at naming the problem through diagnostic evaluation, restoring control of the body, and establishing a safe environment. There is a lot of remembrance with using Herman's. It's a reconstructing of the story, it's transforming that traumatic memory, and again, it's mourning that traumatic loss. And then he looks at reconnection, so learning to fight, taking power in those real life situations, reconciling with oneself and reconnecting with others, and finding a survivor mission and trying to resolve that trauma. Chu believes that we need to look at early stage treatment by self-care, some symptom control, the acknowledgement of the trauma, that trauma has happened to them, that functioning, that expression of affect, and that establishing mutual and collaborative relationships. At the middle stage, they believed in increased symptoms, intense internal conflict. Again, acceptance and mourning, mobilisation, empowerment, and at the last stage, consolidation of the gains and increasing skills in creating healthy interactions with the outside world. So Babette Rothschild, which has a fabulous book with regards to trauma, takes this further and has developed the 10 foundations of safe trauma therapy, which we'll look at on the next slide. This non-evidence-based theory leans towards safety, building a therapeutic relationship, and coping and grounding, and giving that child somewhere to discuss it. So if you just have a quick look at Babette's on the next slide, thank you. So you can Google this to have a bit of a bigger or a sheet to have with you. So Rothschild's 2000 says that first and foremost, we need to establish safety for that client within and outside that therapy, develop that good contact between therapist and client as prerequisite to addressing traumatic memories or applying any techniques, even if that takes months or years. And that's where, as I discussed earlier, we contract for 8 sessions, but if we need to, we will always extend with a child to ensure that we don't leave them in a space that isn't safe and that they've explored everything. A client and therapist must be confident in applying the brake before they use the accelerator. Identify and build on the client's internal and external resources. So we're looking at what have they got around them, who can help. Regard defences as resources, never get rid of coping strategies and create more choices for that person. View the trauma system as a pressure cooker, always work to reduce and never increase that pressure. Adapt the therapy to the client rather than expecting the client to adapt to the therapy. This requires that the therapist has familiar with several theory and treatment, and have a broad knowledge of theory, both psychological and physiological, of the trauma, PTSD, and this reduces errors and allows the therapist to create tailored techniques. Regard the client with his or individual differences and do not judge him or her for non-compliance. And the therapist must be prepared at times, or even for the whole course therapy, to put aside any or all techniques and just walk with that client. So there's some more. I saw somebody put something in the chat, so we'll address that shortly. Thank you. So some of the therapies that we use, sorry if I can go on to the next stage. Thank you. So as I said earlier, we initially start with initial meeting, and then we have a STAR form. We use the STAR form 3 or 4 times within therapy, and we just gauge to see how the child has improved, where they are on that scale. So they get to tell us where they are. It's a scale of 1 to 10. And we have client monitoring forms as well that we bring into therapy. And with a child, our sessions normally are average between 13 to 14. with counselling, we engage with that client and we create a safe space. We are very lucky, as I said earlier, we have these therapy rooms, but we also have a lot of children things in the therapy room. So we have playhouses, we have the worry monsters, we have the Play-Doh, we have the sand, and this helps to work with a child. If they're not having eye contact with you, they're going to tell you a little bit more. So if you ever want to know anything about your children, I suggest you sit in the back and then start questioning them, so they'll start telling you things about their day. We need to provide coping techniques for a child, and that's encouraging the play with friends, listening to music, breathing techniques. So all these come into our therapy. As I said, we have the Play-Doh, drawings, books, therapy cards, worry monsters, fidget spinners. All these to distract a child while they get to talk is absolutely the way forward to get them to come out with those distressing feelings and thoughts. We are very lucky as well that we've been supported, that we are able to provide some of these resources to our children so that they can take them away at the end of therapy, and that they've always got that with them. We provide age-appropriate information through YouTube, and if appropriate, we work with those parents to help that child in between those counselling sessions. And we work towards a close and consolidating what has been learned, which is really important. Thank you. If you can just pop the next slide. Sometimes we do wear our trauma glasses, and sometimes we need to take those glasses off so we can see what is going on in the world around us and notice what is going on for the children and young people that we are associating with and mixing in our lives. So if I could just have the next slide, please. Okay, so when we've got our glasses off, we don't always see why our children or young person are being manipulative, lazy, resistant, unmotivated, or disrespectful, or attention seeking. And if we just pop those glasses on, what we will then see, we will see what all these mean on the next slide. Please. Thank you. Okay. So if children and young people around being manipulative, they're not getting their needs met in ways that have worked in the past, and they're doing whatever is necessary to survive. When they're lazy, it could be that they're overwhelmed and they're lacking those skills to make decisions about what to do first or to organise. Resistant is a mistrust of others due to a history of being hurt by others and scared to make progress and then lose everything. When they're unmotivated, it could be due to depression, fearfulness, being overwhelmed, and also frozen. We've heard today about dissociation, and that frozen can come into that. Disrespectful, feeling threatened, unsafe and out of control, and attention seeking could be because they feel disconnected, loneliness, or have that low self-esteem. So sometimes we put all this down to a child being a child, but actually we just need to put those glasses on to really see what's going on for the people around us. Thank you. If I could have the next slide. So as I said earlier, we do offer our services in the 6 counties. Please, if you want further information or you want to know about our support services and our group therapies that we have in any area that you're in, then please do ring the office. You can also get in touch with us or have a look at our website, which gives you more information. We have an email address for sport@RASOC Wales. This email does allow people to get in touch with us who don't need to tell us too much information about what's going, so they don't have to tell us their real names, and they can just find out information about our service and they can discuss what may have happened. So it gives an opportunity for somebody to start questioning how they can report or how they could come to therapy and discuss that sexual abuse, and gives them that outlet. And we have that as the email support there. And if I could just have the next slide. If you need to get in touch, or talk, then please do also speak to our Live Fear Free helpline, who we work with. They're open 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You can call our office on that number there, or you can do it through our online referral forms, and that's our address at Bangor, and our info email to try and send the information out. So that's my presentation today. I do thank you for listening and hearing about RASOC North Wales. It's been an honour to be invited today and to tell you all about RASOC. But if you have any questions, then please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian and Leah. I haven't seen any questions pop up in the chat. So if there are any questions, can you please post them now? And I'll just give a second for them to pop up. If not, I'd just like to reiterate that we are going to be sharing all of our resources, video links on our webpage in the course of all the events, and nothing's popping up. So just a massive thank you then to Gillian and Leah for your presentation. I found it, really informative, discussing, outlining the CSA, trauma, complex trauma, and ACEs, and then how you can deal with the various traumas. Thank you so much. And as a final thank you then to everybody who's attended, and especially our presenters today. I've thoroughly enjoyed the event. I'd like to give a special thank you to Andy for organising all of this. It's been a bit of a mammoth task, but thank you so much. As the Minister said in the introduction, we are looking to launch a community of practice and peer support network. Details will be shared along with the event and the presentations. We are hosting a number of further events. So this was the first of 4 events that we're going to be hosting this month. So if anybody would like to join any of our further events, Andy will post links in the chat bar. But just to inform you all that tomorrow we've got an adult session, which is looking at female and male victims and survivors. The 24th of March, we're looking at minority groups. So that's Black and ethnic minority, LGBTQ and older people. And then on the 30th of March, we're hosting an in-person event in Cardiff, looking at forensic services. So once again, I just want to say diolch I chi gyd am ddod i'r digwyddiad. Thank you everyone for attending the event today, and I look forward to seeing and hearing from you all again. Thank you all.